In ancient Egyptian history, some dynasties prospered and some faded. Traditional classification divides them into 32 pharaonic dynasties, categorizing them into kingdoms and intermediate periods. The first 30 dynasties in Aegyptiaca, published by Manetho, the 3rd century Egyptian priest, have been lost to the passage of time. These likely stemmed from the Ptolemaic rule in Egypt. The Ptolemaic dynasty and the 31st dynasty form the remaining two. While widely used and valuable, the system does have its weaknesses. Some dynasties only governed part of Egypt and endured concurrently with others based in other cities. The 7th might not have been at all. The 10th appears to be a succession of the 9th, and there may have been one or numerous Upper Egyptian dynasties before the 1st dynasty. The privilege of pharaoh is utilized for those leaders of ancient Egypt who governed after the alliance of Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt by Narmer throughout the early dynastic period, circa 3100 BC. However, the specific title pharaoh was not employed to direct Egypt's kings by their peers until the dominion of Merneptah in the 19th dynasty circa 1200 BC. Egyptian kings used an ancient Egyptian sovereign titulary and the name pharaoh for later rulers. This sovereign titulary, originally featuring a Horus name, prevailed consistently during ancient Egyptian history. Egypt was steadily administered, at least in part, by domestic ruler pharaohs for nearly 2,500 years, until it was overcome by the kingdom of Kush in the late 8th century BC, whose kings embraced the classical pharaonic titular for themselves. After the Kushite victory, the Achaemenid Empire subdued Egypt, with its governors also assuming the title of pharaoh. The last regional pharaoh of Egypt was Nectanebo II, a pharaoh before the Achaemenids defeated Egypt for a second time. Achaemenid control over Egypt ended abruptly through Alexander the Great's triumphs in 332 BC, after which it was controlled by the Hellenic pharaohs of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Their government and Egypt's sovereignty ended when Egypt became a Roman province in 30 BC. Augustus and succeeding Roman dictators were styled as pharaohs in Egypt until Maximinus Daza in 314 AD. This list of pharaohs provides estimated dates. They are based fundamentally on ancient Egypt's established chronology, often based on the Digital Egypt for Universities database generated by the Petrie Museum of Egyptian Archaeology, but other dates taken from other professionals may be designated separately. Egyptian origins and the First Dynasty. Egypt, such a majestic country blanketed by mystery, archaeological gems and sand stretches from end to end. Savants and scholars hold an almost reverential admiration for this land once hosted by the world's greatest and most technical ancient civilizations. Moreover, even the less learned among us are still mesmerized by the idea of a land that had once been a powerhouse of wealth and culture. Ancient Egypt's history spans over 30 centuries, making it easy to become engrossed in its intricate web of anecdotes and captivating accounts. The decades of discoveries certainly do this preeminent civilization justice. However, recovering its artifacts and chronicling its rich history is vast. From all this work, we are introduced to an unmistakably breathtaking culture in all its facets, from bizarre historical figures and mind-boggling advanced architecture to highly unusual mythology and traditions. However, Egypt continues to be an enormous enigma today. We know much about its history and ancient origins, but the more we dig, the wider the gaps in the narrative are. We have only begun to explore the depths of this land's mysteries. As we delve deeper into its mystifying structures and bizarre pharaohs, like Akhenaten and Ramses, we are met with even more questions rather than categorical answers. The two kingdoms of Egypt, Upper and Lower. Forget about what you know about Egypt for now. Leave your knowledge of the pyramids and suspend your Egyptology viewpoint of the pharaohs' crypts and tombs. This is a journey to a time before ancient Egypt's opulence and grandeur. There was sand before the pyramids, the dynasties forged by lost knowledge and high technology, and the pharaoh's opulence. The sand was boundless and seemingly limitless. Despite the transcontinental nature of the land, with the Mediterranean Sea to the north and the Red Sea to the east, one can barely feel respite from the yellowed sands of land previously named Kemet, on some accounts, Misr in others. However, as we soar higher in a bird's-eye view, we can see that the stretch of sand is interrupted by an equally majestic geographical feature: the Nile. The ultimate of all rivers, the Nile rises from the south of the equator and drains into the north of Egypt to the Mediterranean Sea. The Nile River was more than just a body of water for the ancient Egyptians. Its influence trickled into the lives of everyone in its early communities. It provided food and building materials and served as a mode of transportation. Most importantly, it was the lifeblood of the people. Wherever the Nile flowed, that is where the people stayed. Therefore, it is unsurprising that early settlements eventually established themselves along the Nile. Eventually, the Nile no longer became just a provider for the people. In 3400 BC, it was also considered a geographical division between two ancient kingdoms. In about 5000 BC, nomadic groups settled near the Nile as Egypt turned increasingly dry. In the north, a settler community claimed the land for themselves in what they called the Red Land. To the south of the Nile, another group inhabited what was then called the Lower Land. As a result, the Empire of Egypt was divided into its upper and lower halves. At that time, Egypt was widely recognized as the Double Land, or the Two Lands. Between these two ancient communities, Egypt remained divided for centuries. However, a determined monarch was to bring the two kingdoms together and push forward the preeminent civilization we know as ancient Egypt. This is the story of how he and his successors unified a country and birthed the beginnings of a powerful and influential civilization. Join us as we delve into the early stages of a nation that grew to become a globally recognized force in its era. The birth of an ancient civilization. The story of Egypt begins with two kingdoms unified under one regime. Ancient Egypt comprised two rich cultures, the northern and southern kingdoms. Before their union, however, these kingdoms lived not without strife. Still, victory was eventually secured by the southern king, Narmer, purportedly the celebrated and allegedly fabled King Menes. Whether Narmer or a legendary Menes won the victory, we will attempt to uncover the truth later. For now, let us look at the immortalization of this victory in what is known as Narmer's Palette. Uncovered in 1898 in Hierakonpolis, the palette bore the Red Land and the White Land's insignia. This gave way to the theory that Narmer, or Menes, had been the pharaoh who united the kingdoms and became the ruler of unified Egypt. Narmer's first plan was to build the capital of ancient Egypt, Memphis. The Greeks took the liberty of naming this the city of Memphis. The Greeks founded this city in northern Egypt, precisely at the apex of the Nile River. Unexpectedly, he hoped this capital would become a famous metropolis, and it did. Memphis became an indispensable unit for trade and culture in ancient Egyptian society. Inside its white walls, we see the rise and development of Egyptian society and political ideology. It became the home of ancient Egyptian kings, the men who linked the people and gods. The foundations of ancient Egyptian society bloomed inside the walls of Memphis. In its surrounding areas, small farming villages harvest wheat and barley, which laid the groundwork for the state's economy. With the rise of the most advanced civilization, hieroglyphic writing appeared in the arts. Egypt's history began again in 3000 BC. Around this time, Egypt's rich and haunting culture blossomed and became what is now known as the First Dynasty. This marked the first of 30 Egyptian dynasties, lasting over 3 millennia. The 9 kings of the first dynasty. In the succeeding chapters, we will pay tribute to the pharaohs who gallantly led Egypt's country into the marvel it is today. Let us get to know each of them briefly before delving into their lives and accomplishments in the later chapters. Narmer, or quite possibly Menes. We have Narmer or Menes to thank for the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. A centralized government was born from this valiant militaristic campaign. Thus, the first dynasty of ancient Egypt was named. At the time, the capital was still in Thanis. However, Memphis eventually became a center of trade, political power, and religious rites. Narmer married Imhotep, a princess of the ruling. It was said that this marriage was carried out to cement the burgeoning empire further and stamp out the possibility of rebellion from the North's people. Horahah. His son, Horahah, succeeded Narmer. Although there have also been speculations that Horahah was Menes, we subscribe to the previous assumption that Horahah had been Narmer and Imhotep's son. Horahah had remained loyal to his father's political decrees and military policies. He continued the then ongoing conquest of the land of Nubia. He was a particularly devout pharaoh, paying attention to religious rites and spending his time building tombs like mastaba. His architectural feats served as a precursor to the pyramids. Memphis's necropolis can be traced to this pharaoh, seemingly obsessed with the afterlife and death culture. Jer. Following a timeline, we meet the son of Horahah next, Jer. Like his father and grandfather, Jer sought to expand the land and accomplish architectural work, tombs, and temples. Egypt bloomed in trade and industrial matters as a nation during his seat in power. Jet. Jet, the son of Jer, was not a particularly popular king. Records from his reign are scarce. What we do know, however, is that he was buried in Abydos with his retainers. Mernith. His wife, Mernith, succeeded Jet. Although she served as a regent to the throne for her son, Den, she still established her authority during her time in power. She introduced reforms, and her influence long after her reign is still evident in how her son ruled the state. Den. Den is renowned for being the first king to wear the crown of a unified Egypt. In his 50 years on the throne, he expanded Egypt's influence, even conquering Sinai. Den was considered the greatest king of the first dynasty. Under his power, Egypt thrived in trade and military exploits. Anegib. Little has been recorded of Anegib, but his reign was said to have been characterized by turmoil and rebellion. Semerkhet. He was best known as the usurper of the throne. However, recent evidence suggests that Semerkhet is having trouble keeping the kingdom in line. Qua. Finally, we arrive at the last ruler of the first dynasty. Qua could rescue Egypt from the bowels of destruction his predecessors had left it in. Under him, the state became prosperous, and luxury was abundant. However, he could not leave the throne with an honest heir. Instead, after his death, war broke out. Horus Bird and Sneferu were contesting the succession. A third claimant to the throne succeeded, so the second dynasty of Egypt began. Menes, Narmer, the first kings of the first dynasty. Despite the two kingdoms' unification, duality remained an organizing principle for the ancient Egyptians. Life and death, Upper and Lower Egypt, and the arid desert around the fertile river valley are the remnants of what was previously known as the Double Lands. In the same vein of duality, we now return to the debate between the founding pharaohs. Was Egypt founded by Menes or Narmer? You see, in the previously mentioned Narmer's palette, there are two images of a king. One bore the crown of the Red Land and the other of the Desert Land. Some theories believe that one was Narmer and the other Menes. Thus, we are once again pulled back to pay respect to the ancient guiding principle of duality. Nevertheless, instead of pitting these figures against each other, let us get to know them first. Narmer. We first meet Narmer, which means Horus is the striker in ancient Egyptian. Narmer was the southern king who was married to Imhotep A, the princess of the northern kingdom. From this marriage, scholars have deduced that this was a political agreement meant to strengthen the ties between the two kingdoms. Narmer was said to have reigned over Memphis for 62 years. Writing was widespread even in this infant stage of Egyptian civilization, and plenty of hieroglyphics exalt King Narmer. However, these bits and pieces of information barely form a straight narrative of the full story of Egypt's unification. For example, archaeologists have managed to dig up Scorpion's mace head and a vase containing symbols for the king scorpion and the Narmer palette. However, it is difficult to conclude these findings. Perhaps the earliest capital site holds the answers, but until then, we can only speculate. Menes. On the other side of the scenario, we have King Menes. Interestingly, this king is prominent in textbooks and history publications, but no proof exists. Today, it is debated that the great King Menes is a fabrication of the people, nothing but a part of a cultural tradition handed down through classical traditions. Nevertheless, let us suspend our disbelief momentarily and get to know the man behind the legend. Menes is also famously credited with unifying the two kingdoms that make up ancient Egypt. His name roughly translates to "he who endures," and he has done that. Despite the almost total absence of his name in archaeological records, Menes has remained top of mind in ancient Egypt's historicization. The Royal Conundrum. Scholars and archaeologists have explored the enigma of ancient Egypt's first kingship, offering a variety of theories. Some say Narmer and Menes are the same. Others say Menes is the successor to Narmer, better known as Hor-Aha. Whoever may have overseen the military and political maneuver that brought about the kingdom's unification is secondary to the feat itself. It is essential that whoever he, dare we say her, was, they have achieved the almost impossible achievement of marrying the North and South cultures. This eventually bolstered the people and the culture into more glorified and majestic times. From this point forward, Egypt's history began. Everything that has happened before, it has been cast aside as mythology. Hor-Aha, the second king of the first dynasty. Indeed, there is substantial debate regarding the identity of the founding pharaoh of the first dynasty in ancient Egypt. However, we know who succeeded Narmer or Menes, Hor-Aha, or simply Aha. Also known as Horus the Fighter, Hor-Aha was said to have been the son of Narmer. He rose to the seat of power when his father died when he was 30 years old. He was said to have ruled until the age of 60. Hor-Aha is known to have performed numerous religious rituals during his reign. Artifacts attributed to his reign have improved greatly compared to the previous rule. This can be considered a testament to the economic prosperity that occurred during his time on the throne. This esteemed king was married to Benerib and Kenthap. The latter bore him the son, Jer, soon to be the next king of ancient Egypt's first dynasty. Hor-Aha met his doom when he was carried away by a hippopotamus. According to other records, a hippopotamus eliminated him while he was out hunting. Either way, this strikes an uncanny resemblance to the recorded manner of death of King Menes. It is then also speculated that Hor-Aha and King Menes are the same. Either way, Hor-Aha's reign ended, and he was buried with the royal household members. He would have been the first pharaoh buried with servants after death, which was revolutionary. In his tomb were servants, dwarves, dogs, and even a group of young lions as a sign of his royalty. Over 36 of his subordinates were buried with Hor-Aha. According to Egyptian belief, his legacy continues, and those buried with him will continue to serve him in the afterlife. Jer, the third pharaoh of the first dynasty. For the sake of following a timeline, sans all the theories that obscure a short succession of the throne in the first dynasty, we come upon Jer as the third king of ancient Egypt. This would then mean that Jer was Horah's son and the grandson of Narmer. He was married to Den and succeeded by Jet. Hieroglyphs on ivory and wood labels claim he ruled for about 40 to 60 years. People said he carried out numerous military exploits against the Libyans during his administration. One ivory tablet tells the tale of Jer's visit to Buto and Sais in the Nile Delta. There was also a record under his reign called the Year of Smiting the Land of Setjet. Theoretically, this refers to his adventures and the subsequent conquest of the land of Sinai. In addition to his military feats, Manetho, an Egyptian priest, also claims that Jer produced a treatise on anatomy during his time. This treatise was to be used even 2 millennia after his reign. He continued his father's tradition of being buried with his attendants during his death. Around 300 of his subordinates joined him in the tomb. Alongside his body and those of his retainers, several objects such as vases, bracelets, and ivory tablets were also available in his tomb. Diet, the fourth king of the first dynasty. Hor-Jet, which meant Horus Cobra or Horus who strikes, was named after the vulture goddess of Upper Egypt, Wadjet. Manetho records Jet as the ruler known as Wenephes. Throughout his 23-year reign, very few of Jet's reforms and rules were documented. Alternatively, if they had been, we have yet to discover them. However, excavations near Abydos have revealed his final resting place. Over 174 retainers were discovered in this tomb. Speculation suggests that he buried some family members with him, but the majority were his servants. Just subscribe to the belief that he needed his servants to be buried with him to continue serving him in his afterlife. Mernith, the queen of the first dynasty. Although technically a regent to the throne for her son, Den, Mernith ascended to the throne after her husband, Jet. We find evidence of her rule in her tomb in Abydos. It was of the same scale and size as those of the kings during her time, leading scholars to speculate that she did indeed become pharaoh at some point. Den, the sixth king of the first dynasty, also known as Horden, King Den managed to propel Egypt into prosperity and wealth. He introduced innovation during his time. He is better known for being the first king to be depicted wearing a crown for Upper and Lower Egypt. Anejib, the seventh king of the first dynasty. Hor-Anejib, despite having very few records about him, managed to stay in power for over 26 years. Despite his lack of popular support, bloodshed and rebellion marred Anejib's reign. Records of Anejib are scarce. His reign was said to have been characterized by turmoil and rebellion. The end of his days in power was also claimed to have been a violent one. Semerkhet, the eighth king of the first dynasty. We then meet the tragic legend of Semerkhet. Manetho chronicles a particularly gruesome calamity during this young king's reign. For this reason, Semerkhet had difficulty managing the throne and Egypt's burgeoning empire. Qua, the ninth king of the first dynasty. Qua was the final king of the first dynasty of Egypt. Although inscriptions in stone vessels claim that he was on the throne for over 33 years, there are few records about his reign. The end of his reign, however, is much more stirring. Despite the prosperity of his reign, he could not establish a legitimate succession to the throne. As such, Sneferu and Horus Bird both fought for power. Eventually, a third party named Hotep Sekemwi ended the fight and took the throne himself. Memphis, the city of kings. One can barely historicize Egypt without paying homage to Egypt's first capital, Memphis. If Egypt were home to the oldest civilization in the world, then Memphis would be its hearth. This was where the flames of history were stoked, from a little ember to a full-scale fire that blazes to this day. Memphis was where the first pharaoh took residence and introduced reforms and governing rules to the nation. Originally, Memphis was known as Huay-Ka-Ptah, which roughly translates to the mansion of the spirit Ta. It was a center not only for trade, but also for religious rites and rituals. Located at the Nile entrance near the Giza Plateau, Memphis was also known as Inbu Hedge. This name was descriptive of its white walls because Memphis was built almost entirely out of mud from the Nile, turned into brick, and then painted white. Memphis was an architectural marvel. Its surrounding walls were built to keep the Nile from flooding the city. Egypt's first pharaohs reigned from this capital, which enjoyed a high level of prestige even long after the country's capital was transferred elsewhere. To this day, Memphis is considered a religious center where one can find shrines and temples of worship for the gods and goddesses of Egypt. The way of life in the First Dynasty. Like their predecessors and successors, the previously divided communities of ancient Egyptians depended on the Nile for sustenance and daily means. The rich soils brought harvest and wealth along its banks to Egypt and its people. However, as the Nile provided for the people, it sought payment from the souls benefiting from it through annual flooding. This was how the people grew to develop and nurture their craftsmanship in building mud brick homes. The capital, Metself, had a dam that protected the inner city from damage year in and year out. The inner part of Memphis is home to the priests and scribes of the time. Together with the farmers and other population members, these citizens were all subjugated under one ruler, the pharaoh. Several tribal settlers, led by different men, now had a centralized and omnipotent ruler who could lead socio-economic reforms and exercise political control. During this time, religion became a more organized affair. The belief in the afterlife was further cemented by the first kings of Egypt. It was said to have been under Hor-Aha's regime that the Egyptians became particularly obsessed with the afterlife. Although they emphasized the grandeur of an opulent life, the pharaohs took the afterlife to a different level. Afterlife in the First Dynasty, ancient Egypt. As with many other cultures, the ancient Egyptians heavily anchored their beliefs in the afterlife. From the remnants of this long-gone civilization alone, one can surmise that even the pharaohs of the First Dynasty were hounded with the need to aid their Ka, also known as their essence or life source, so that they could return to their bodies. As kings, they naturally believed that service was required even in the afterlife. They buried their subordinates alongside them, from Hor-Aha to the succession of the throne, ensuring that the leaders would be as comfortable as they had been during their time on earth. Alongside servants and court jesters, their pets, food, jewelry, and other essential items were buried with the pharaohs to give them passage and comfort in their afterlife. Although pyramids were yet to be built during the First Dynasty of ancient Egypt, the early pharaohs of this time still managed to be buried in multiple funerary complexes. From King Hor-Aha, with his 36 retainers, to King Jer, with 318 of his most loyal retainers buried with him, it has become a tradition for pharaohs to be buried with what they have considered necessary for their life. Eventually, the popularity of retainers started and ended with the First Dynasty. It is believed that this funerary ritual did not endure because the retainers themselves could no longer be convinced that they needed to continue serving their pharaoh in the afterlife. They argued that they could find and serve their pharaohs when their time came, not as the pharaoh himself passed. We could also attribute the decline in retainer sacrifice to what were known as the Shabti figures. These natural forms are meant to replace the retainers aiding their pharaohs in the afterlife. The text that would bind these forms to serve the pharaohs in the afterlife is engraved on these Shabti figures. Religion in the First Dynasty. Even before Egypt was formalized as a sovereign state ruled by one king, the belief in gods and goddesses survived throughout ancient Egyptians' early human experience. one will almost certainly encounter the god Atum in the early Egyptian records. To Atum, the Egyptians owed the very creation of the world. It is believed that Atum merely spoke the world into existence amidst the swirling chaos of a time before creation. By his side is the god Heka and the other spiritual world. To Heka, the Egyptians owed the primal force of the universe. Moreover, through Heka, the Egyptians believed they could achieve ma'at, or balance and harmony. From these guiding principles, gods and goddesses branched out. Horus was one such god who was associated with the pharaohs of Egypt. It is believed that the god Osiris would stake his claim on their souls and deliver them to the eternal kingdom. Osiris, his wife, and sister Isis oversaw the monarchs who ruled over Egypt's ancient civilization. Ancient Egypt's gods and goddesses were revered and prayed to at every turn for daily blessings. Combat in the first dynasty. For a civilization in its infant stages, the early pharaohs of Egypt knew they needed to establish dominance over the land through military exploits. In addition to expanding their trade and growing the empire's wealth, they also sought to expand the kingdom through military campaigns. The early kings of Egypt were each effective rulers in their own right. Under their rule, the land flourished and Egypt's borders expanded. Soon, the empire ultimately became an urbanized state. Coming from a purely agrarian culture, this was a giant leap into becoming a civilization with the means and metal to challenge other existing ones. Still, the pharaohs were careful not to follow in the footsteps of their Mesopotamian brothers. At the time, such cities were plagued with overpopulation, which resulted in overuse of natural resources. The beginnings of Egyptian hieroglyphics. Despite the Greek origins of the word hieroglyph, the Egyptians created their own symbols. At the time, this system recorded events and messages called Mdju Netjer, or only words of the gods. Archaeologists have dug up the early uses of hieroglyphics written on bones and ivory tags. Pottery and clay seals have also incorporated some of these markings. All these were found in tombs in Abydos, in the tombs of the pharaohs of the First Dynasty. Although little is known about the development of Egyptian hieroglyphs, their early use in Abydos's tombs solidifies the claim that this writing system dates to at least the First Dynasty. True enough, there are short phrases and singular words to go by. However, it is believed that this is because the early times of the Egyptian dynasty were the development stage of what was eventually to be a budding system of recording and writing. Some scholars believe this particular language's emergence could be traced to an even earlier time before Egypt's unification. Others also believe that the Egyptians merely borrowed this system from Mesopotamia. However, evidence has recently surfaced that points to hieroglyphs being used during the reign of King Scorpio, preceding the scripts uncovered in Mesopotamia. Before the formation of Egypt as a unified state, it is believed that Egyptians had been using hieroglyphs to record their history and traditions. However, this brutal act required considerable skill, time, and concentration. Thus, by the time the First Dynasty rolled by, the Egyptians had finally developed a more simplified script, known as the hieratic. Said hieratic was still based on hieroglyphics. Learning and writing are much simpler and more comfortable. Hieratics were written on papyrus to translate and transmit religious text and record-keeping. The Third Dynasty, the Age of Discovery. When we look at Egypt today, we see a globalized nation set against the backdrop of an ancient land. Everywhere we look, there are reminders of bygone eras juxtaposed with the metropolis's bright lights and thriving center. This is modern Egypt as we know it. It has matured alongside the rest of the world, maintaining its status as a land synonymous with its history and architecture. Over the years, men and women of power have succumbed to the allure of modern civilization. Pursuing a single global economy has resulted in relinquishing rich cultures and traditions. However, one northeastern African country has managed to ride the tides of modernization while remaining grounded in its roots. Nevertheless, we are not here to marvel at this country's resilience against gentrification. We ask that you join us as we peel back the layers of time and strip away the sky-high buildings, paved roads, and other modern reminders. We shall take you on an adventure to an earlier Egypt, at the early stages of its architectural triumphs. Together, let us explore this country by revisiting it from an earlier time, a time that scholars dubbed Egypt's Third Dynasty. A kingdom at its discovery, life in the Third Dynasty. The Third Dynasty is still far from the ancient Egyptian powerhouse we see and learn about in books and movies. Therefore, setting the stage for documentation is more significant than ever. Egypt's upper and lower parts have only recently been unified into a single state. Egypt was beginning its journey as a kingdom, poised to achieve even greater feats. In due time, it will fulfill its destiny of becoming a preeminent civilization in the Mediterranean. Moreover, the people and their pharaohs will soon build elaborate tombs, monuments, and hidden labyrinths. However, it is still 2670 BCE, and the pharaoh Djoser has just ascended to the throne. As it does today, Egypt stands as a proud yet dry desert landscape bordered by land and sea. To its north is the Mediterranean Sea, opposite it is Sudan in its south, to the east is the Red Sea, and to the west is Libya. Nevertheless, despite its position near water bodies, the ancient Egyptians still depended heavily on the Nile River's annual inundation. Egypt was a hot and arid dust bowl without the Nile's sustenance. Sand and drought stretched for miles on end. Because of these harsh conditions, the people needed to find relief from the unforgiving heat. Thus, ancient colonies pooled around the River Nile to create what was to become the greatest and most revered civilization at that time. Because of the location of these colonies, life in the Third Dynasty was primarily centered on cultural activities. The ancient Egyptians practiced science and knowledge, which became the bedrock of Egyptian wealth. Owing to the kingdom's riverside nature, fish was vital to these ancient people's diet. The marshes also abundantly cultivated papyrus for various purposes, including sandals, rope, and most importantly, paper. In addition to cereals, papyrus as writing material became a chief export at the time. The people lived in clusters near the Nile Delta and its valley. Most of their houses were built mainly from mud brick and organic materials. As was foreseeable, this architectural foundation was no match for the annual flooding at the time. Soon enough, these mud brick settlements were obliterated by the continually rising water of the Nile. This is probably why the population, especially the elite, favored the higher grounds of the riverbank. City centers such as Memphis and Thebes attracted the citizens, while the rest settled around these centers to engage in cultural activities. Life in the early part of the Third Dynasty was much more peaceful, especially after the turbulent few years before its foundation. The people were still recovering from civil unrest and hopeful that the new pharaoh would bring them their much-needed respite. The beginnings of the Third Dynasty. The beginnings of the Third Dynasty follow the significant military campaigns of the Second Dynasty. However, as with most details in the earlier dynasties, there are only limited accounts regarding the period's founder. One of the principal candidates that the Third Dynasty of Egypt can be attributed to is Djoser, who succeeded the last king of the Second Dynasty, King Khasekhemwy. His reign was to mark the foundational beginnings of a period called the Age of Pyramids, a time of significant technological advancements in stone architecture. From Memphis, the white-walled capital of the state, this epoch's kings were to dream up major innovations for their nation's architecture. Back then, this was considered a massive departure from the structures of mud bricks made previously. Before the innovations introduced in this transitory period between the old and new kingdoms, tombs, houses, and other buildings were built of mud brick. These tombs were made of mastabas mud brick. As one might imagine, these were of low hardiness and could be easily swept away by the unforgiving waters of the Nile. Another development that marked this era was establishing independent states throughout Egypt. While the central power remained in Memphis, power was disseminated over lesser districts or nomes. These expansions and growth in all aspects of ancient Egyptian life have established the foundation of the Third Dynasty of Egypt. Thanks to its reforms and new traditions, some scholars argue that the Third Dynasty should be introduced as the Old Kingdom's advent, rather than as part of the country's early dynastic period. Djoser, the first king of the Third Dynasty. Before exploring the strokes of architectural genius exhibited in the Third Dynasty, let us pay homage to the man in charge of all these pursuits. Djoser succeeded the last king of the Second Dynasty, King Khasekhemwy. It is assumed that this young new king had been the son of the previous pharaoh, or at least linked in some way through his mother, Queen Nimaithap. We learn of this connection through the German Egyptologist Gunther Dreyer. He and his team discovered Djoser's sealings at King Khasekhemwy's tomb, suggesting that the king had prepared and furnished his tomb. During his 20-year reign, Djoser had taken charge of various reforms and architectural innovations throughout the land. One of his more prominent accomplishments is erecting the complicated funerary rite outside Memphis at Saqqara in Lower Egypt. What sets this complex apart from the time structures is that it was made entirely of stone instead of conventional mud bricks. This setup has revolutionized more than just the material. The complex's shape underwent a complete transformation. They transformed the traditional rectangular-shaped structure with a flat top into a 6-step pyramid. This was the first ever pyramid built in what was later known as the Land of Pyramids, Egypt. Naturally, one can easily accept that Djoser's reign influenced the foundation of the world's foremost civilization. He spent most of his time in power with architectural preoccupations. He built on the previous dynasty's initial successes before him and cemented Egypt's glory throughout the land. Under his rule, cities, also known as districts, thrived and exhibited more sophistication in the architectural arena. This mentation was first introduced to society, and symbols became aplenty. People used these symbols to commemorate the gods of the time. Djoser dispersed power throughout various city districts from his throne in Memphis, the then capital of Egypt. Thanks to Djoser, the country emerged from its darker days to a time of wealth and peace. This is partly owed to his success in expanding Egypt's borders through the military expeditions he sent. For one, the Libyans were no longer a threat to the peace that the Egyptians enjoyed. He had defeated them in battle in the early years of his reign. His legendary armies instantly stamped down any threat to this newfound prosperity. Lastly, Djoser effectively ended famine for the people by rebuilding the Temple of Khnum. This success had been named the Famine Stele, an especially notable success for Djoser. Law and order governed the land. Djoser was able to set about what he had always wanted to do, leading architectural progress all over Egypt. His reign ended in death, and he was eventually buried in his famous pyramid at Saqqara. Djoser left a lasting legacy as an enterprising and just pharaoh. Undoubtedly, his advisor played a significant role in remembering his reign, and Imhotep, his most loyal vizier, played a significant role in his success. Imhotep, the architect of the first pyramid. It is almost impossible to separate the name Imhotep from the successes of the Third Dynasty, especially in architecture. Imhotep was an Egyptian priest, poet, astronomer, architect, physician, and vizier to King Djoser during his time. People say his name translates to "he who comes in peace directly." Although a commoner by birth, Imhotep eventually gained footing as a respectable member of society through sheer talent and tenacity alone. He was a profoundly spiritual man and became a high priest of Ptah. His knowledge of the gods elevated him to Djoser's advisor, and he was initially appointed to oversee the construction of the king's tomb. Before Imhotep and Djoser's revolutionary architectural strides, the Egyptian mastabas were rectangular and made from sun-dried mud bricks. Their primary material consisted of limestone blocks adorned with engravings. It is unclear why Imhotep has transformed this tradition and created the pyramids to date. Whatever his reasons, it was clear that Djoser was impressed by the construction Imhotep had overseen. He was so impressed that he disregarded the tradition of having solely the king's name appear on monuments. He disrupted this ancient precedent by inscribing Imhotep's name in his various monuments. Evidence points to the fact that Imhotep had gone on to serve the succeeding kings after Djoser. Rumors even suggest that Imhotep served as many as 4 kings during the Third Dynasty. Imhotep's architectural genius and knowledge of the gods earned him reverence and respect throughout the land. Aside from these, he also served as Egypt's physician. In addition to the step pyramid, his numerous medical treatises have garnered admiration. As a medicine man and a man of religion, his central hypothesis among these treatises is that diseases had been sent to the people by the gods as punishments. Ailments were considered curses instead of the medical anomalies they are today. Although we now know better, many people still considered him a talented genius of his time, one with considerable skill and intellect. His works even reached far empires, including Rome and Greece. In his death, Imhotep was the only Egyptian, besides Amenhotep, to be deified. Eventually, people worshipped him as the god of wisdom and medicine. However, some sources also say that he was known as the god of architecture. Still, out of all his successes during his time, one of the most critical successes owed to Imhotep is his step pyramid. Djoser and Imhotep's step pyramid, the first pyramid of Egypt. Egypt is today known as the land of pyramids. Naturally, building the first pyramid is a monumental and pivotal moment in this vast land. They built the first one, the step pyramid at Saqqara. This first pyramid is believed to be traced back to the Third Dynasty, the time of Djoser and his royal architect Imhotep. This marked a time when mastaba tombs were to be replaced by pyramids as the eternal fortresses of Egyptian pharaohs in their afterlife. Although the logic behind this shift in entombment structures is still unclear, Djoser and his vizier Imhotep made history. Upon closer study, scholars believe that the construction of the step pyramid had not been without difficulty. Evidence suggests that there were a few false starts during the construction process. Furthermore, even after the foundations were laid, the king and his advisor still had to divide the construction into several stages. Imhotep had not initially planned to revolutionize the construction of the pharaoh's tomb. He had started conservatively, intending to build a traditional mastaba tomb. The most impressive mastaba had been 20 feet in height then, and Imhotep had only initially set out to exceed this. In this initial attempt, the resulting mastaba started with a square base. However, Imhotep eventually changed this to a rectangular one. This has led scholars to believe that in the initial stages, Imhotep had merely set out to introduce the change in the foundational structure of the mastaba. They planned to build this initial mastaba in 2 stages. First, they laid out the masonry at an incline to build the pyramid. The purpose of this was to enhance the mastaba's structural stability. After this, engravings and inscriptions were to be added to honor the king's tradition before such time. However, only the second part of these 2 construction stages received honors from history. The towering mastaba pyramid had been the highest and most impressive of the land so far. This is for sure. Nevertheless, an integral part of constructing a traditional mastaba had been altered. Imhotep had created a tomb out of stone instead of dried mud this time. A significant amount of trial and error Towering at over 204 feet, 62 meters, this was quickly the tallest tomb and even structure during their time. Around it are various structures such as a temple, several shrines, some courtyards, and even the ancient priests' living quarters. The expansive design spanned over 40 acres, 16 hectares of land. A wall up to 30 feet, 10.5 meters, protected this, ensuring its safety and security. Trenches surrounded it for a further 2,460 feet, 750 meters. To get inside the courtyards of this vast and impressive structure, one had the option of choosing among 13 doors. However, one of these doors would lead you where you need to be. This door was in the southeast corner of the wall. Djoser and Imhotep had designed the step pyramid to be impenetrable to unwanted guests. Not everyone could enter the vicinity. Only a few were allowed to enter its inner courtyard and temples. The rare few honored to enter the step pyramid were met with a stunning and magnificent complex. It had several complexes inside: the House of the North, the Northern Mortuary Temple, the Serdab, the Hebsed Court, the House of the South Tomb, and the Temple T. In all its 16 hectares, the complex was roughly the same size as a typical city at the time of the Third Dynasty in Egypt. This pyramid alone was believed to have been even more significant than the city of Hirkanpolis during such a time. There was a monument to Djoser at the Serdab, a life-sized statue believed to keep the pharaoh safe on his journey to the afterlife. Furthermore, it is theorized that the north and south houses represented the divide between Upper and Lower Egypt. Djoser was so proud of this architectural feat that he broke tradition and inscribed Imhotep's name on the monument. What was initially an honor reserved for the pharaoh was overlooked because of Imhotep's sheer architectural genius. When Djoser died, his body was buried right at the base of the pyramid. The tomb can only be likened to a labyrinth, with multiple tunnels and rooms created to confuse and possibly entrap robbers who would dare enter, take the jewels, and be buried with the king. At the very center of this maze is Djoser's burial chamber. Made from granite, it was almost impossible to reach with the dozens of corridors one had to navigate. Of course, these other chambers were not just there to confuse grave robbers. They had historical and spiritual uses. For example, one such chamber was meant for ceremonial purposes, and another contained multiple stone vessels with the names of earlier kings. So, were all these precautionary measures effective in thwarting grave robbers? Indeed not. Ancient robbers eventually found their way in and stole the legendary king's burial items and even his mummy. Only parts of his mummy were left, alongside some of his valuables. Despite this rather tragic end to such an essential stroke of genius, the step pyramid has set the foundation and advanced how tombs were built. Even the Fourth Dynasty kings were to pattern the architecture from this initial feat, including the Great Pyramid of Giza, the age of the pyramid builders. Much has been debated whether the Third Dynasty earned its rightful place to be considered one of the dynasties in the age of the pyramid builders. For most scholars, this was a time of the Old Kingdom, when architectural feats, including the Pyramid of Giza, had been completed. Some scholars argue that the step pyramid was merely an accomplishment of the early dynastic period. However, it is still widely accepted that this specific age includes Djoser's revolutionary constructions, his successors, and the architect Imhotep, the buried pyramid, Sekhemkhet's unfinished tomb. Of course, the Third Dynasty's successes did not just start and end with the step pyramid. Sekhemkhet, his eldest son, succeeded Djoser. He held the throne for a mere 10 years. In keeping with his father's accomplishments, Sekhemkhet too decided to build a pyramid, the second one of the Third Dynasty. What became known as the Buried Pyramid was initially patterned after the Step Pyramid at Saqqara. King Sekhemkhet had grand plans for this pyramid, aiming to surpass the Step Pyramid in size and design. However, its construction barely made headway before Sekhemkhet's rule ended with his death. The fact that it barely reached ground level earned it the buried pyramid. Although much of the construction is still underground, archaeologists have eventually gained access to its complex. The buried pyramid is located southwest of Djoser's step pyramid in Saqqara. The base was about 377 feet, 115 meters long. Inside was an unfinished burial chamber, no doubt for the king Sekhemkhet. Although the king's mummy was not located inside this tragically unfinished pyramid, the remains of a 2-year-old had been dug up together with gold leaf fragments inside one of the chambers. The pyramid's construction is identical to that of its predecessor, the step pyramid. However, the limestone casing was never added because it remained buried in the sand. The walls, clad in Tura limestone, reached a height of only 10 meters before construction was halted when the king died. The pyramid's actual entrance and features Sekhemkhet had planned for its inner walls have yet to be established. The enclosure wall bore Imhotep's name, just like the more successful step pyramid. This suggests that the great architect's services were passed on from one regime to the next. Kaba's layer pyramid. Not much success followed Djoser's step pyramid, not with Sekhemkhet's buried pyramid and the one that followed that, Kaba's layer pyramid. Kaba was the third king of the third dynasty. El-Haram el-Midawar, also known as the Rubble Hill Pyramid in Arabic, primarily shaped his legacy. Eventually it was named the Layer Pyramid. Archaeologists excavated this third dynasty pyramid in the necropolis of Zawiat el-Aryan. Although not causally linked to any pharaoh, it is widely believed to have belonged to Kaba. In the third dynasty, Kaba's higher officials constructed the Layer Pyramid at the center of their mastabas. It is located at the necropolis of Zawiat el-Aryan, just a few kilometers southwest of Giza. The structure itself is nestled on top of a rocky ridge. Upon further inspection, the Layer Pyramid was found to have a square base, which is about 276 feet, 84 meters, on each side of the square. This, of course, is much smaller in the dimension of the pyramids of the two previous kings of the third dynasty. Although unfinished, Egyptologists believe that the Layer Pyramid was initially intended to reach 150 feet, 46 meters in height. However, the pyramid's ruined state only allowed up to 56 feet, 17 meters, of the original structure. This amounts to about only 2 steps of what was to be a 5-layer pyramid for King Kaba. Indeed, there is insufficient evidence to determine whether years of neglect left the pyramid unfinished or merely ruined. Scholars believe the mud bricks in its surrounding walls were a construction ramp. After all, the dawn of limestone construction was already in full swing, so it no longer made sense for Kaba to return to the traditional mud brick construction of tombs. A 118-foot, 36-meter stairway greets you as you enter the complex. Following this steep flight of steps, one is led down a west corridor. This ends in a shaft and an unfinished corridor going south. Ascending the shaft, one encounters a crossway that leads further down the corridor or a narrow stairway. Eventually, one will reach a burial chamber and several other chambers that housed the dead pharaoh's valuables. Kaba's burial chamber was square, with a base of 11.9 feet by 8.7 feet. However, the king's missing remains and the absence of goods in the chambers point to Kaba's untimely death. The Layer Pyramid remained unused for many centuries until archaeologists eventually discovered it. Despite that, it is still an architectural marvel that was to be assigned to the third dynasty of Egypt. The first true pyramid by the last king of the third dynasty. Eventually, we reach the fourth and last king of the third dynasty, Huni. Some accounts mention the pharaoh Huni, but we still lack the material to tell a story about his reign. Without significant evidence pointing to a wrong time, scholars have assumed that Huni had merely led a peaceful and non-disrupted reign. Scholars attribute the construction of the Medum Pyramid to him. However, this has recently been contested, with scholars saying that this last pyramid was an initiative of Huni's son, Sneferu, the first king of the fourth dynasty. Whether we can assign this to Huni or Sneferu is still unclear. How Imhotep's design for the step pyramid served as the model for this architectural feat. The architect himself was a successor to Imhotep. Unfortunately, Imhotep's unsuccessful modification of his design led to the collapse of the pyramid. The Medum pyramid was known for its unusual appearance while still standing. This was a direct result of the errors committed in its construction. Such errors included having the outer layer built on sand instead of rock. This resulted in the pyramid's weak foundations. Next, the pyramid's inner steps had been designed and added last, instead of supposedly ensuring that it is one of the primary concepts. All of these missteps eventually resulted in the compromised stability and eventual collapse of the Medum pyramid. The ruins of the Medum pyramid still stand at 213 feet, 65 meters in height. The descent to its chambers is still at 57 feet, 17 meters in height. Despite this seemingly impressive structure, even in its ruined state, the pyramid was likely to have been left unused by both Huni and Sneferu. Although we know this to be the first true pyramid, there are claims in the local landscape that the Medum pyramid is a false pyramid. Perhaps owing to its shape, or the fact that it had collapsed before fulfilling its purpose, we will never know. We know this now rests in Lower Egypt as a tower-like structure instead of an actual pyramid. A higher noble's mastaba stands near its location, but its history remains undiscovered. Sneferu and his father Huni never finished their project, so they spent time building 2 more pyramids at Dashur. The good news is that the Medum pyramid had not been the only architectural project undertaken by Huni. Huni also received credit for the Turin Canon and possibly the city of Enes. Indeed, the people continued to remember him long after his death. There has been evidence that points to the longevity of his mortuary cult. An account from the 12th dynasty of Egypt even mentioned his name, a testament to his accomplishments and honor that transcended generations. His death, however, marked the end of the glory that was the Third Dynasty. His successor was to initiate a period that would bring Egypt to even greater heights. The legacy of the Third Dynasty. Whether the Third Dynasty is to be considered part of the age of pyramid builders remains a topic for debate. However, the works of Imhotep and the succeeding architectural feats of the pharaohs of the Third Dynasty cannot only be overlooked. All 4 pharaohs and Imhotep and his successors revolutionized the architecture of Egypt. This concerns the pharaoh's tombs, homes, and other buildings. Before such time, most of the complexes and even the prior generation's temples had been made from mud brick. However, the call for novelty and stronger foundations pushed Imhotep and the first king of the Third Dynasty, Djoser, to take a gamble and break free from construction tradition. The result of the chance they took to revolutionize construction. Lasting buildings that could last well into the next millennia. Moreover, of course, they had handed down one of the remnants of a once healthy civilization in the past, the pyramids. Without their genius, who knows what the state of architecture in Egypt would have been today? In an alternate world where Imhotep and Djoser had merely followed traditional dictates and did not veer from the usual mud brick construction, we probably would not have the pyramids we know today. There would be no basis, and excavations would be the basis of Egyptology. In time, the desert's scorching heat and the Nile's annual flooding would have destroyed all the valuables, tombs, and shrines. Without these resilient structures, we would not have access to the earlier lives of the ancient Egyptians. While most scholars merely consider the Third Dynasty to be a transitional phase between the early dynastic period in Egypt and the Golden Age of builders, we are inclined to believe that this dynasty was foundational and not just transitory. Djoser dreamt up a much more fortified structure for his entombment, and although rudimentary, he set off generations of pharaohs and builders in the right direction. After the Third Dynasty ended in 2613 BCE, Egypt gradually transitioned into an era known to scholars as the Old Kingdom. However, the legacy it left for the Egyptian people was the foundation for the dynasties that followed this peak period. It paved the way for military and architectural accomplishments that were not easily forgotten. The Fourth Dynasty, a golden age of pyramids. The setting sun lights the sky with myriad blazing colors, bathing the colossal edifices that dominate Egypt's golden desert sands. These mammoth monuments are Giza's pyramids, the most iconic symbols of a golden age long gone by. So let us retrograde in time and visit the age of peace and prosperity, wealth and riches, and enormous strides in art, architecture, science, and medicine. This is the age when wondrous things happen, and the world is beautiful and exciting. This is the Pyramids' age when art and science were melded to create the most significant symbols of all time's power. Thus our journey begins, back to the old kingdom of ancient Egypt, where the mighty pharaohs had the power and resources to undertake these massive construction projects. However, this does not happen immediately. The age of the pyramids circa 2613 BC, 2494 BC. First, the Third Dynasty of this age took the time to stabilize the kingdom, ward off foreign threats, and develop a robust economy to prepare for the future. And then comes the Fourth Dynasty, and the ancient kingdom explodes in a flurry of construction, the particulars of which have never been seen before and will never be seen again. These constructions are a testament to the ancient Egyptians' mathematical skills and construction ability, a skill no other civilization has surpassed. Beginning with Sneferu, whose experiments led to the creation of those perfect, right, smooth-sided pyramids that today dominate the Giza Plateau, to the great pyramids built by the legendary kings Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaure. This is a time when history is written in stone. The Fourth Dynasty, a brief history. Few records exist of this dynasty. What we know about this period is based on the many inscriptions and monuments unearthed over the last few hundred years. Nevertheless, here is a strange thing. We know more about the founder of this dynasty, Sneferu, than any of the other kings. In fact, by the time we reach the end of this dynasty, there is practically no information about the final rulers of this glorious era. Furthermore, while the pyramids remain silent, the elite's tombs in the mortuary temples tell us a part of the story of their construction. Stelae found around the kingdom add to that story. These tombs are painted with beautiful reliefs depicting scenes of daily life, including the clothes worn, the crafts made, and even the courtiers' occupations at the king's palaces. Stone inscriptions found scattered in the desert sands add to this age's story, and the first pyramid texts in the tomb of the last king of the Fifth Dynasty, the pharaoh Unas, have helped shed light on the belief system of the Old Kingdom. Furthermore, the strong, centralized government led by the pharaohs of this age, a well-organized and methodical bureaucracy, and a treasury full of coffers enabled the builders of this time to create majestic stone masterpieces that continue to awe to this day. This is the only dynasty that carried out such extensive constructions, and that too on such a massive scale. During this dynasty, the Great Pyramid of Giza was built and became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. So what led to this frenzy of building during the Fourth Dynasty? Well, religious changes were taking place at this time. The cult of Ra, the sun god, is currently growing in popularity, and the relationship between the pharaoh and the gods of Egypt has become unchallenged. Before the Fourth Dynasty, the afterlife resembled an idyllic place similar to Elysium, accessible only to kings and those with pure hearts. Now this concept of the afterlife begins to change and takes the likeness of earth. Moreover, this change has led to a shift in the construction of tombs. Tombs now contain earthly treasures and pleasures the dead can take to the afterlife. They are lavishly decorated with detailed writings that tell of their immense wealth and standing in life and guide them to the afterlife. These are what we today call the pyramid texts. Scientists are currently unraveling the complicated procedure of body preparation, which has become crucial for the preservation of the dead. The embalmer's role is created, whose sole job is to prepare the dead for the afterlife. Moreover, because of this change in religious belief and mortuary customs, architectural changes were made, which led to the creation of the pyramids and mortuary temples that fascinate us today. Having learned a little about the Age of Kings, let's learn more about each king and how their land and history shaped them. Sneferu, the bringer of beauty, circa 2613 BC, 2589 C. The fourth dynasty's first pharaoh, Sneferu, was the bringer of beauty and master of justice, and ruled the Upper and Lower Nile. Born to a family in Hermopolis in Middle Egypt, he married Hetepheres I, most probably a royal princess, and his half-sister to boot, to gain access to the throne of the kingdom. We don't know Sneferu's father, but his mother was Meresan-Ka'oros. Some scholars believe that his father was Huni, the last pharaoh of the third dynasty, and that his mother was either a minor wife or a concubine. Many scholars feel that the theory of Sneferu being the son of a concubine is flawed, since it would have robbed him of royal status and prevented him from ascending to the throne of Egypt. The ancient Greeks called him Soros, but his real name, Sneferu, means "he has perfected me." While there is some discussion about how long he reigned, he generally ruled Egypt for about 30 years or more. Whatever the case, Sneferu was a great king his people loved. This was a man who loved a good time. When he was young, he frequently ran away from his teachers and took pleasure trips down the Nile with his friends, many of whom were beautiful maidens. However, despite his frequent frivolity, Sneferu was a knowledgeable man, extremely educated, and loved flowery speeches. He was unconventional and unaffected by royal protocol. He called people around him "my friends," regardless of their status, and this quality of his endeared him to the people of Egypt. When he became pharaoh, he focused on the development of his nation. He promoted agriculture and founded and maintained numerous agricultural homesteads across the land. He also focused on stud development to improve the quality and population of cattle in Egypt. He increased the mining production of malachite, cupreous, and turquoise, not just in Egypt, but also in foreign lands. To ensure that the kingdom had a steady supply of cedar wood, that resource that Egyptians so prized, Sneferu had 60 huge ships made, some more than 50 meters long, to carry out trade expeditions in Phoenicia. He used much of the imported wood to build his fortress and other monuments. During his conquests of the Libyan and Nubian kingdoms, Sneferu had access to a vast labor force and natural resources. According to the Palermo stone inscription, Sneferu captured many people from other kingdoms and added them to his labor force. In fact, he brought back 11,000 prisoners and 13,100 head of cattle from Libya alone. Thanks to his many military and trade excursions, Sneferu brought ebony, gold, ivory, olibanum, also called frankincense, and exotic wild animals to his kingdom. He was among the most successful in the 30 dynasties that ruled ancient Egypt. Of course, people remember Sneferu for his building projects regardless of his political and military accomplishments. He built fortresses, palaces, houses, shops, temples, and of course pyramids. He is the only king of the Old Kingdom whose works have survived in such numbers until today. 3 of the 90 pyramids that still stand in Egypt were built by Sneferu. The first pyramid Sneferu built was the Meidum Pyramid. Located in Memphis's plains, this is the first ever straight-sided pyramid built in Egypt, and the second ever built in the history of ancient Egypt. The Bent Pyramid in Dashur, the royal necropolis, was Sneferu's second pyramid. After the failure of the Medum pyramid, Sneferu's builders tried again. However, halfway through, they had to correct glitches in calculating the wall's angles. Consequently, they named this pyramid Bent. However, the real name of this pyramid translates to Sneferu, is shining in the south. The Red Pyramid, or the North Pyramid, and El Haram El Watwat, which translates to the Bat Pyramid phrase, to the locals, is the third and largest pyramid built by Sneferu. It is also the first true pyramid of Egypt and the third largest pyramid ever built after the ones built on the Giza Plateau. With each of Sneferu's projects, we see technological, architectural, and innovation advances, showing us how much progress was made during this king's reign. This is the only time in ancient Egypt's history that there have been so many breakthroughs and changes, not just in the building but also in living standards, religious beliefs, and culture. Khufu, the divine creator, circa 2589 BC, 2566 BC. Sneferu was not just a prolific builder but also a prolific creator. By death, he had left behind 14 sons and daughters and many more grandchildren. Of them, Khufu, his son by his chief wife, Hetepheres I, became his successor. Khufu was known by many names. The ancient Greeks called him Cheops, and sometimes Sufis and Sophia, while the Arabs called him Saurid and Salhuk. He was the second ruler of the fourth dynasty and the builder of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Khufu's full name, Khnum Khufu, meaning Khnum protect me, is a dedication to the Egyptian god Khnum, the god of the Nile, who represents creation and growth. Khufu saw himself as a divine creator, which he believed was a role given to him by Khnum himself. Khufu's first two wives were his sisters, Merititis the Fierce and Henutsen. Like his father Sneferu, he had numerous descendants. Sadly, the crown prince died before Khufu's reign ended, so his second in line, Djedefre, became king upon Khufu's death. As with his father, we do not know the length of Khufu's reign. However, modern scholars believe this pharaoh ruled for about 26 or 27 years. We also do not know much about Khufu's reign, but based on the inscriptions discovered, we know that Khufu sent several expeditions to the Sinai, looking for more turquoise and copper. He also sent multiple expeditions to Byblos to trade copper tools and weapons in exchange for their cedar wood. We know that Khufu was the most fantastic builder of all the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. He built the Great Pyramid of Giza. The entire construction of that pyramid took 20 long years and became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and the only one that still survives. Khufu and his architects are credited with the sheer genius of building this marvel. Historical references tell us everything we know about Khufu as a person and ruler. He has been depicted as cruel and tyrannical, as someone who made his people suffer tremendously. He forced his people to labor for 20 years to build his Great Pyramid, and when he ran out of money, he supposedly sent his daughter to a brothel and ordered her to earn a specified sum so that he could continue funding the building of his Great Pyramid. Interestingly, Khufu's reputation has been tarnished over the centuries. Philosophical and cultural beliefs changed over the ages, and slowly the large tombs of ancient kings were looked upon with disapproval, as they were considered symbols of overweening egos. Another reason Khufu's reputation could be so maligned is his very name. The Coptic version of the pharaoh's name is Shephet, which means sinful and adverse luck. This name turned into Sufis, and the name's interpretation could also have influenced later historians' perception of this monarch. Some scholars also believe that his people could have damaged Khufu's reputation. They would have seen the construction of the pyramids of Giza and the enormous amount of labor going into making these giant tombs, and they would have passed on these tales to their young ones, soon making it an oral tradition that later historians documented. However, many modern historians now feel that Khufu's terrible reputation over the centuries has been misplaced. They use the example of his mortuary cult to prove that Khufu was not as bad a man as he was later perceived to be. To better understand why this is relevant to Khufu's reputation, we must first understand what a mortuary cult is. A mortuary cult is a religious practice that develops over time. It is usually a shrine with the bust of the deceased built by those left behind. These shrines were important during ancient Egyptian times and would last centuries. Archaeologists confirmed that in the 6th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, 67 priests and 6 high officials served in Khufu's necropolis. Khufu's famous father, Sneferu, had only 18 mortuary priests serving his necropolis during the same period. His successors, Jedefra and Khafra, had only 8 and 28, respectively. If Khufu had been as unpopular a king as the later historians suggested, he would not have had such a substantial mortuary cult. We will never know whether Khufu was a good or bad person, a tyrant or an able ruler. We are aware that he left behind an edifice that has not only endured over time, but has also demonstrated to the modern world the high levels of skill, sophistication, and art that the ancient Egyptians had attained. Jedefre, the son of Ra, circa 2566 BC, 2558 BC. Jedefre, the second son of Khufu, called Ratwaz by the ancient Greeks, ascended to Egypt's throne after his father died. It is not known for certain who his mother was. He became the first Egyptian king to take on the title Sa-Re, son of Ra. Khufu's eldest son, Kawab, was the intended heir to the Egyptian throne, not Jedefre. However, Kawab died before his father, so the crown passed to Jedefre. 2 of Jedefre's queens are known from the scattered remains of the past: Hetepheres II, Kawab's widow, and their sister, and Kentatenka. He had at least 5 children, at least those known, but none ascended to the throne on his demise. Instead, it was his brother, another son of Khufu, who reigned after him. According to the Turin King list, an ancient Egyptian hieratic papyrus, most probably from Ramses II, Jedefre reigned for only 8 years. However, more recent evidence indicates that he may have reigned for over 11 years. His pyramid at Abu Rawash, which was never completed, supports the theory that he reigned for only a short time. Because Jedefre's pyramid was never completed and lies in ruins now, there was little evidence of his mortuary cult. The pyramid was named Jedefre's Starry Sky. Moreover, his name, Jedefre, means enduring like Ra, and he is known by other names, Jedefra, Rajadef, and Rajadef. Based on Jedefre's pyramid's location away from Giza, scholars believe the family split after his ascension to the throne. There is an old story that Jedefre murdered. All his statues in his funerary complex were defaced and smashed, supporting the idea that the family disapproved of Jedefre. Khafra, the next king of Egypt, moved the construction of his pyramid back to Giza, next to his father's pyramid, which also backs this theory. Many scholars believe that his successor was responsible for destroying the funerary complex. However, newer evidence and a reassessment of Jedefre's pyramid complex dispute these theories. Firstly, Khufu's funerary boats bear Jedefre's name, which means he was mostly responsible for burying his father. Secondly, the defacement of the king's statue was the work of locals, especially during the Roman and later Christian eras. Many scholars now believe that Jedefre built his pyramid in Abu Rawash because he was a Ra follower. By building his temple in this place, Ra's followers would be able to see the sun rising directly above Ra's sun temple at Heliopolis on the summer solstice. New evidence at the funerary complex at the Pyramid of Jedefre also proves that his mortuary cult was active many years after his death. This would not have been possible had Khafra tried to remove all signs of Djedefre's presence from this world. Khafra, the son of the sun, circa 2558 BC, 2532 BC. Once again, little is known about Khafra's rule during the Fourth Dynasty. What scholars know of this king comes from Greek history, which was written 2,000 years later. While archaeological discoveries made in recent times have added a little to our knowledge of this pharaoh and his rule, most of it has been swept away by the sands of time. We know that Khafra was Khufu's son and the previous monarch's brother, Djedefre. We also know that Khafra had multiple wives, at least 12 sons, and either 3 or 4 daughters. Many knew Khafra. His birth name was Khafra, which means appearing like Re, but Greek historians also called him Khafra, Khephren, Chephren, or even Rakhaef. Manetho, the historian, called him Sufis II. Once again, we only have a general idea of how long Khafra reigned. Most scholars agree that it would take between 24 and 26 years. This conclusion is based on a stunning discovery, the will of one of his sons, Prince Nekure. The will was carved into the prince's mastaba tomb walls, and its date was inscribed. Khafra is credited with building the second largest pyramid in Egypt, second only to his father, Khufu's Great Pyramid. His pyramid was named En-Khafre, which translates to Khafre is great. Like his grandfather and father, Khafra was a prolific builder. He did not just build his pyramid. He also built the Great Sphinx, the Sphinx Temple, the Valley Temple, and his mortuary temple. Khafra is also known to have built more statues of himself than any other Egyptian king in the Fourth Dynasty. Little evidence of those glorious times tells of a flourishing and prosperous kingdom. These conclusions have been drawn based on the beautiful mastaba tombs of the elite of his time and the last will left by his son, Prince Nekure. Khafra also had strong foreign trade relations with neighboring and faraway kingdoms, since artifacts dating to his time have been discovered in modern-day Syria and Lebanon, as well as ancient Nubia and Sinai. What is known about this pharaoh as a man comes from Greek historians who wrote about him 2,000 years after his death. Moreover, his character has been as maligned as his father's. These historians portrayed Khafra as a cruel tyrant and a heretic. Despite the mystery surrounding these ancient kings and their rule, Khafra has left behind some of the most magnificent memorials of the past. His life-size diorite statue, unearthed in Khafra's Valley Temple, is one of the most stunning works of art ever found in ancient Egypt. Bikeris, the first ephemeral king, circa 2532 BC. The line of succession of the kings of the Fourth Dynasty is shrouded in mystery. The first cause for confusion is the identity of the fifth ruler of this dynasty. This lack of clarity is because the ancient Greek historian Manetho lists Bikeris, and not Menkaure, as the fifth ruler of this dynasty. Bikeris has also been named Bakare in several king lists. The problem is that Bikeris is the Greek name of this pharaoh, but there is no corresponding Egyptian name that could help scholars put things in perspective. Scholars have speculated about these kings, but archaeological evidence does not confirm their existence. The damaged Turin Canon king list, which places another king between Khafra and Menkaure, lacks the king's name. The only possible evidence could be an unfinished pyramid at Zawiet el Arian. The Italian Egyptologist Alessandro Barsanti discovered the pyramid in 1904. He found the tomb shaft with inscriptions in black ink, a few of which contained a royal cartouche name. Sadly, Barsanti did not replicate that cartouche. He made a few poorly drawn pictures where most of the glyphs, except for the royal cartouche, were illegible. All that scholars could glean from those copies was the glyph Ka, which indicates a king's name. According to another Egyptologist, Peter Janosi, this mysterious king's name could be Baka, which was written with the symbol of the ram and the ka, similar to what was found in that cartouche. Furthermore, Jedefre had a son by that name. This potential connection between Baka and Bekeris adds another layer of intrigue to the mystery. Therefore, after Khafre's death, Baka may have ascended to the Egyptian throne and changed his name to Baka-Re upon coronation. If this theory is correct, Bekeris and Bakare could be the same person and the unknown king who ruled between Khafre and Menkaure. Modern-day scholars believe that if Bekeris existed, he would have ruled for a short time, 2 years or even less. This is why there are practically no monuments except that unfinished pyramid, or documents from his time as king of Egypt. Menkaure, the last great pyramid builder, circa 2532 BC, 2503 BC. Menkaure was either the 5th or 6th ruler of the 4th dynasty. Whatever the case, he was a powerful ruler. However, history remembers him as a generous king. Menkaure had at least 2 wives. His eldest Quenre died before Menkaure, and his younger son, Shepseskaf, succeeded his father to the throne. It is also known that several of Menkaure's half-brothers held the position of vizier during his reign. He may have ruled for around 22 years based on recent archaeological evidence. Menkaure was the last of the pharaohs to build a massive pyramid. His 3rd and smallest pyramid on the Giza Plateau is named Netjer-Menkaure, which translates to Menkaure is divine. Ancient reports say this pyramid, a quarter the size of his father Khafre's, was the most beautiful. Menkaure also built the Valley Temple, which was extended during the 5th and 6th dynasties. It is here that some of the greatest treasures of ancient Egypt, dating back to Menkaure's time, were unearthed in the 19th and 20th centuries. One of the most beautiful statues ever found, Menkaure and his queen, was excavated at this site. Several other statues were also discovered here. All of them were of triads of Menkaure with different deities. Once again, what we know of Menkaure has been passed down from the ancient Greek historians who portrayed him as a just and pious king, easing the suffering that his father and grandfather before him had caused to Egypt's people. Herodotus, the Greek historian, wrote that when Menkaure ascended to Egypt's throne, the kingdom was already weakened because of the extravagant monuments built by his forefathers. The kingdom was also rife with dissent due to the unjust rules of Khufu and Khafre. He had to re-establish the concept of the divine pharaoh, as the priesthood had gained significant power by this time. Oracles of the time foretold a period of hardship that would last 150 years. They claimed that Khufu and Khafre had caused the kingdom's people hardship. They also predicted Menkaure's rule would be tumultuous and ended after 6 years as punishment. According to legend, Menkaure was a wily king who circumvented the oracle's curse and lived to rule for more than 20 years. Shepseskaf, his soul is noble, circa 2518 BC, 2510 BC. Shepseskaf is generally considered the last king of the 4th dynasty. However, there is controversy about that fact, which we address later. Shepseskaf ruled for a noticeably short time. Seskafshi reigned for a notably brief period following Menkaure's death approximately 8 years ago, while simultaneously completing his predecessor's pyramid and temple complex. There is a lack of clarity about who exactly Shepseskaf was. Most Egyptologists accept that he was Menkaure's son. However, some believe there is insufficient evidence to prove this theory correct. This theory that Menkaure was Shepseskaf's father is based on discovering a decree that refers to Shepseskaf as the person who completed Menkaure's pyramid and temple complex. However, this does not mean that Shepseskaf was Menkaure's son, since the decree did not specify the relationship between the two monarchs. A king completing his predecessor's tomb does not necessarily mean the two were related. We know nothing specific about Shepseskaf's family. The identity of Shepseskaf's mother remains unknown. although some scholars have proposed that she could have been one of Menkaura's queens. This lack of evidence about Shepseskaf's family underscores the uncertainty that often accompanies historical knowledge. In addition, Queen Bunafar, Shepseskaf's priestess, may have been one of his wives. Furthermore, Kamat, the wife of a nobleman named Ptashepsis and known as a king's daughter, could have been Shepseskaf's child. All of this is conjecture since no archaeological evidence supports these theories. The many funerary inscriptions in the tombs of the officials who served Shepseskaf confirm his reign. Most of these inscriptions merely reference the king, signifying his brief reign. We do not know anything about Shepseskaf as a king or a man. What made him stand out among the rulers of the Fourth Dynasty was that he was the only king who could not build a pyramid for himself. Instead, his tomb was a massive mastaba located at Saqqara. The mastaba was initially known as Shepseskaf is purified. Today, this monument is called Mastabat al-Fir'aun, which means bench of the pharaoh. Rather than basing his tomb on the pyramids of his own dynasty, Shepseskaf appears to have modeled it on the stepped mastabas of kings from the First and Second Dynasties. The fact that Shepseskaf chose to build a mastaba rather than a pyramid has puzzled scholars. There are multiple theories about why he would have done this. The most accepted theory is that he was planning to build a pyramid. However, he died soon after the work on his tomb commenced. Thus, his successor or queen may have turned the tomb into a mastaba to bury him. The Palermo stone, one of the oldest Old Kingdom texts, suggests this. Thamphthis, the second ephemeral king, circa 2500 BC, Banku. Many historians consider Shepseskaf the last king of the Fourth Dynasty. However, Manetho listed Thamphthis as the final king of this dynasty, which led to conflicting opinions. He ruled for 9 years after Shepseskaf's death. According to him, Thamphthis ruled for 9 years after Shepseskaf's death. The biggest problem that scholars have faced with this mystery is that Thamphthis is the Hellenic version of the Egyptian pharaoh's name. The Egyptian name of this king, if he existed, was lost to time a long time ago. However, scholars still speculate that his name could have been Jedefta or Ptajedef. Time's ravages have severely damaged the Turin canon, leaving severe gaps in the king's list. Manetho based his king list on the Turin canon, so if the Greek historian had mentioned it, it could not have been ruled out that the Turin king list did not have Thamphthis' name. This mystery becomes even more profound because the royal king list, the Saqqara table, has 2 cartouches after Shepseskaf. This means there is a distinct possibility that 2 kings of the Fourth Dynasty ruled the kingdom after Shepseskaf died. One may have been Thamphthis, but the other remained a complete mystery. Most modern scholars face the challenge of finding no mention of Thamphthis in the tomb inscriptions of multiple high-ranking officials who served under multiple kings. For example, Prince Sekhemkare's tomb has inscriptions that report his experiences under Khafre and Shepseskaf from the Fourth Dynasty, and Userkaf and Sahure from the Fifth Dynasty. Another official, Netjer Pu result. The tomb also has details of his career while serving Jedefre, Khafra, Menkaure, Shepseskaf, and Userkaf Sahure. According to the late Egyptologist Patrick F. O'Mara, none of the elite tombs in Giza and Saqqara mention the name Thamphthis in their inscriptions. We will never know the truth. It was swept away into the desert of this ancient land a long, long time ago. The Fifth Dynasty, reign of the Sun Kings. Egypt inspires immense admiration due to its allure and mystery. Scholars and scribes handle the remnants of its ancient dynasties with the utmost care, speaking almost reverentially about its history. Its contributions to the human experience deserve the pedestal we placed it on. We respect it, are fascinated by it and continue to explore the hidden gems encrusted by its layers of sand and time. The Old Kingdom's dynasties are undeniably linked to secrecy and closely guarded secrets. The dunes of the land have all but devoured evidence of such a time, giving archaeologists nothing but evidential fragments. As a result, there is much room for debate about this period's early dynasties. Who was the first pharaoh who succeeded whom, and what contributions each pharaoh made to the empire? Clarity only comes in the Fifth Dynasty. It is a timeline that is better recorded and verifiable by archaeological sources. So, we celebrate this period of ancient Mediterranean civilization as we explore its complex history and find out how the Fifth Dynasty of Egypt fits into the narrative of the long line of Egyptian dynasties. An introduction to the Fifth Dynasty. Let us take you back to the reign of the Sun Kings. Imagine the following scenario. The year is 2494 BC, and the pyramids of Giza have just been built. The sand framing of the mortuary complexes still has not settled and remains disturbed by the toil of the people who built them. The structures themselves are still fluorescent from recently mined limestone and granite. Time and grave robbers have yet to raid the tombs. Sneferu and Menkau, the pharaohs of the previous dynasty, remain undisturbed in their eternal slumber. This is the stage of the Fifth Dynasty of Egypt. Of course, we know that these architectural successes will captivate archaeologists and scholars in the following millennium. In the next centuries, people from all over the world will marvel at their design genius. Nevertheless, it is still 2494 BC, and the ancient people of this powerful civilization are once again at the foot of a new dynasty. Egypt has just closed its chapter on the architectural promises of the Fourth Dynasty. When Sneferu rose to power after Huni, the people rejoiced. However, the nation was wary and could only hope that Userkaf and his descendants would maintain the Fourth Dynasty's success. The Fifth Dynasty held little promise. Except for its histrionic characteristics, its successes paled compared to the previous dynasty. Nevertheless, the records of the Fifth Dynasty give us a glimpse of a pivotal time in Egyptian society. This ancient civilization underwent a radical alteration in religion, creating an exciting period for its leaders. Buildings honoring a solar cult would rise to a high point. Although this riode may not captivate all scholars, the religious undertones in its narrative continue to captivate us. The writers of this book are interested in the interest of religion. Wars have been waged, kingdoms have fallen, and ordinary men have been forced into situations that propel them to rise as heroes. This is what religion does. Furthermore, coincidentally, this is the story of the Fifth Dynasty. 2494 to 2345 BCE was a time littered with religious upheavals. Most of the undertakings were religious in context, from the architecture built to the pyramid texts that were to be inscribed. Are you prepared to explore this intriguing era and discover its mysteries? Allow your imagination to soar as you journey through the timeline with us in this book. The Fifth Dynasty at infancy. Life after the era of Great Pyramids. The death of the Fourth Dynasty and long foretold the genesis of the Fifth Dynasty was tragic. The pages of a prosperous time, passages from the papyrus Westcar, convey that King Khufu of the Fourth Dynasty was warned that he and his heirs would be overthrown by the triplets of a priest of Ra in Sakhbu. His response had, like any other king in his time, he ordered the death of the priest's children, Userkaf, Sahara, and Neferir-Kara. The stuff of legend, a material fabricated from the lack of information about the dynasty's transition. However, the religious context in this retelling of the beginning of the dynasty is nearly palpable. Not to mention, the god Ra will be a constant character in the narrative of the Fifth Dynasty. He would transcend. In this dynasty, he would surpass the reign of the 9 pharaohs and construct structures in his honor. The Old Kingdom endured. Politics would solidify during this period of deep reverence for the sacred gods. The rulers, gods, and people divided ancient Egypt into regional units. Nevertheless, all these small-scale nations were eventually united, and pharaohs were to oversee all dealings in the land's vast expanse. This was the birth of the ancient kingdom of Egypt. Even though the Old Kingdom citizens had already started to acknowledge the throne's power, it took longer to unite the once divided people's non-secular beliefs, at least not until the 5th dynasty. In the 5th dynasty, life was easy, or at least this is what ancient texts will say. This is, of course, a highly biased statement, because the accounts of the daily life of this long-ago period only recount the lives of the wealthy. Just think about it. Monuments were created for the affluent. The 5th dynasty honored wealthy individuals by immortalizing them in accounts. Nevertheless, what of the ordinary people, those who worked in the field and served the rich? We are aware that the pyramids of their masters stand in stark contrast to the simple funerary arrangements where their stories now lie. They are forgotten if they survived eternal servitude and were not buried with their kings. Egyptian towns, as opposed to the metropolitan superpowers where the kings and their high officials resided, can no longer be located. The ordinary life of the 5th dynasty has eluded ancient texts. Nevertheless, we can make a few assumptions based on what we know. We know that the 4th dynasty made pyramid building a norm. Mortuary complexes had peaked in sophistication, and the people of the 5th dynasty struggled to maintain this new normal. They failed, of course, and only succeeded in building smaller and less sturdy structures. We also know that the gateway to these pyramids, the ancient city of Memphis, was considered the capital during this period. Nevertheless, unlike modern nations' capitals, Memphis was not just a site for commerce and administrative power. More than anything, it was the center of worship. This ancient Egyptian city excavated temples in every nook and cranny. Just outside, the middle class resided. Dockyards, workshops, and farms traced the walls of the city, the birth of the 5th dynasty. So far, we have lauded the 4th dynasty for its significant contribution to Egypt. Ironically, the dynasty's achievements, which led to the golden age of pyramids, brought it down. Sure enough, Giza's mortuary complexes were grand and magnificent, and had quickly served as trailblazers for the next construction. Nevertheless, there is one problem. They were also very exorbitant. By the end of the 4th dynasty, the royal treasury had been used to construct these grand tombs. We still don't know exactly why they started a new dynasty. Even Userkaf's rise to power, the first pharaoh of the 5th dynasty, is still unknown. It is theorized, though, that the 5th dynasty began to respond to the call for a new order in the Egyptian government and an overhaul of the then-current religious context. From the vantage point of architecture, the 5th dynasty built on the pyramid complex's blueprint and standardized their construction. This is probably why the wealthy members of this dynasty didn't build pyramids comparable to those of the 4th dynasty. The government would not permit such extravagant displays of wealth. At the beginning of the dynasty, he underwent reform. Compared to the previous rule, there were many higher officials during the 5th dynasty. This number was significant because the first pharaohs recognized the need for an efficient bureaucracy. As Egypt grew in power, they realized that the administration needed to expand beyond the throne. As a response, the pharaoh opened the court to individuals outside the royal family. Without this restrictive familial rule, high officials and dignitaries increased. This efficient division of power is why we know much more about the 5th dynasty than any previous eras. After all, accounts were no longer solely centered around the throne. These affluent dignitaries not only had the sense to immortalize the happenings of the time, but they also acknowledged the importance of keeping an account of their triumphs. At some point, I noticed how interspersed life was in the 4th and 5th dynasties. This is probably because most of the latest dynasty innovations were built upon the previous one's foreground. Although this is true, religion distinguishes these two Old Kingdom dynasties. The dynasty of the Sun Kings. The royal titulary does more than dictate the title of the pharaoh in a period. It also reflects the beliefs of the time. Horus and Nebti became the mark of the kings of the previous dynasties. This time, the 5th dynasty kings took on the royal titulary Re, which causally linked them to the solar cult, the son of Ra. Thus, they have been aptly called the Sun Kings, the pharaohs of the 5th dynasty who elevated the sun god Ra to the nation's religious consciousness. An account from the Westcar Papyrus, The Birth of Kings, introduced the first 3 Sun Kings of the 5th dynasty. This story asserts the divine appointment of these first 3 kings, Userkaf, Sahuri, and Neferir-Kara, Kakai, according to some accounts. At this point, the ancient Egyptian civilization transitioned into a new era. Before it, Egypt was primarily a polytheistic nation. This implies that distinct regions of the country honored multiple gods. This was the structure of religion at the time, with the inhabitants of a specific location worshiping these local gods. This polytheistic religious composition persisted from Egypt's unification in the 1st dynasty to the next dynasty. Nevertheless, eventually, just as there became one appointed leader of the state who would rule over all of Egypt, Userkaf also appointed a god for the nation, his chosen god, the sun god Ra. Just as the pharaoh oversaw the whole land, the sun god Ra was to transcend space and become the nation's supreme god. This was a bold move for the young king, but he cemented this decree by building a sun temple in Abu Ghurab. This also set the stage for his successors, who started the dynasty of Sun Kings. The Sun Kings of the 5th dynasty. The sun god Ra was to have 9 kings of the 5th dynasty serve his name. Although we have Sneferu to thank for the initial association with the sun, the 9 kings of this dynasty would elevate him to a god of the state, a god for all of Egypt. This book introduces these 9 kings and their contributions to Egypt's growth as an international superpower. We begin with the first Sun King, Userkaf, and follow his lineage to Unas, the final king of the dynasty, first Sun King. Despite his relatively short reign, Userkaf introduced numerous reforms to Egypt during his power. Despite the lack of a direct link to the previous dynasty, numerous assumptions about his descent exist. The most plausible of these is that he belonged to the royal family of the 4th dynasty. The value of all these is that he was part of the royal family from the 4th dynasty. However, an assumption that might also be true is that Userkaf was the son of Kenkawes. Although accounts about her are unavailable, she occupies one of the Giza pyramids. She must have been a significant figure because of the laws that governed ancient Egypt during her time. Before Userkaf ascended to the throne, he believed that he had been a high priest for the sun god Ra. Of course, this might explain why he imposed his religious beliefs and brought them to a national scale. His choice to elevate Ra in position would secure the next 80 years of Egypt's religious sector. The military expeditions and pivotal government that Userkaf introduced have not received much written attention. Based on the timeline of his reign, one might surmise that he was the pharaoh who initiated Egypt's relationship with its Aegean neighbors, particularly in commerce and trade in his mortuary temple, suggesting this might be true. Regarding expanding Egypt's reach and power, Userkaf was believed to have sent an expedition to Nubia to temper down rebels, which he had elected to build his pyramid. Pieces of evidence gleaned from his tomb also point to the fact that he succeeded in his military expedition against the Asiatic Bedouins during his brief time in power. In matters of state, Userkaf had appointed non-members of the royal family to high power too. However, Userkaf is renowned for having introduced the solar cult to the country. One of his projects was the Temple of Montu at Tod, found in Upper Egypt. Albeit humble in structure and design, the small mud brick chapel established his stance on religion then. He also built a temple solely for the sun god Ra in northern Abusir. However, he constructed his mortuary complex in Saqqara, a location most pharaohs had selected for their eternal resting place. Userkaf's mortuary complex stands solitary, as he did not feel the need for his followers to surround him in death. He did, however, choose to be entombed near Djoser. It is believed that he chose this spot to support all that the previous pharaoh had symbolized: harmony and altruism. When Userkaf rose to power, people believed he had advanced in age, but he died 8 years after ascending to the throne. The Sun King had completed his journey, and that is when he rested. Share. Userkaf's son Sahure assumed power after the first Sun King's demise. In the 12 years he was in power, he elevated Egypt's culture and power. By the end, his reign was regarded as the pinnacle of the dynasty at the time. Userkaf initiated foreign trade, and Sahure received credit for its success. Historical records point to multiple expeditions to foreign lands in his time. Consequently, he propelled Egypt's economy forward by dispatching naval fleets to Lebanon and other lands. The reliefs in his mortuary complex are a testament to this free-flowing trade he had nurtured with the Asiatics. In his 12th year on the throne, also his last year, Sahure sent an expedition to Punt's land, which is assumed to be modern-day Somalia. He loaded enslaved people and malachite into his ships on the coast. During his reign, he also attended to multiple quarries. Like every other pharaoh in ancient Egypt, Sahure faced challenges to his power. This time, his adversaries were the Libyans from Chemehu. Some of the reliefs in his tomb also depict his triumphs against pirates terrorizing the Nile Delta villages. Like his father, Sahure's motivations were mostly religious. The Palermo stone documents that Sahure's journeys were to attend largely non-secular ceremonies. During his reign, he appointed over 200 priests and assumed the title Nberth, which meant Lord of Doing Effective Things. Furthermore, Sahure supported allowing citizens to occupy high offices as his father did. Thus, the evolution of kingship continued with Sahure as one of the leading proponents. When he died, he was entombed in a pyramid he had constructed near his sun temple. His pyramid, smaller than the others, was named Kaaba Sahure, or the Rising of the Ba Spirit of Sahure. Even in death, he continued to profess his worship for the sun god that his father had brought into the nation's consciousness. Neferkare Kakai. Sahure's son, Neferkare Kakai, was the former king's eldest. He ruled over Egypt with the wisdom of his father. He led the nation benevolently and kindly during his 11 years on the throne. While he had inherited power during an incredibly prosperous time in ancient Egypt, he continued to drive the nation to grow. He empowered priests that he had appointed as officials. As a result, they accumulated sufficient wealth, allowing them the freedom to construct their architecturally sound mastabas where they resided, and wrote autobiographical accounts of Egypt during the 5th dynasty. He had been the last to introduce significant royal titulary modifications. In his first year as the head of the nation, he had granted land to estates of the cult of Kerala's gods. Naturally, he did not overlook the sun god. To him and his cult, Neferkare Kakai appointed 210 daily offerings as a standard for the god's table. The king also built the temple Setibre, the site of the heart of Ra. Neferkare Kakai's work as a pharaoh was mostly religious. There is little evidence of his military feats. However, there is reason to believe he sent a few raids to Libya and Sinai. He reportedly conducted simple trade operations and never ventured beyond Nubia. When he died, he was buried in the Ba Neferir Kare, or Neferir Kare takes form, found in Abu Sir. By 5th century standards, his tomb was the largest one built in this period. Around his tomb were the smaller pyramids of his close family members, forming an architectural unit. Neferefre. Next in Userkaf's line was Nefrefre, likely the eldest son of Neferir Kare Kakai. In his early years, the palace called him Prince Refer. His reign had been short, only 2 or 3 years as a pharaoh. The excavation of his mummy revealed that Neferefre had passed away at the young age of 18, 20 at the latest. Although there is much debate about the actual length of his reign, Werner posits a likely rationale. When the young king ascended into power, he immediately started the work for his tomb in Neferefre. However, evidence indicates that the construction abruptly stopped only 2 years after it began. This strongly suggests that the king had met his untimely demise. The tomb was known as the Netjeri Bao Raneferef, which means the Bas of Neferefre are divine. He planned to build a sun temple, just as the kings before him had. His offering to the sun god Ra was called Hotep Re, which means Ra's offering table. Despite his incomplete architectural projects, Neferefre is remembered for his mummy excavation. On the east side of his pyramid, researchers had dug up his wrappings and parts of his human remains. Parts of his clavicle and his hands were still intact, and the way he was mummified conformed to the standards of the Old Kingdom. Shepseskare. Noble is the soul of Ra is the rough translation of this king's name, a testament to his continuous worship of the god Ra. He was believed to have been the brother of Neferirkare Kakai and the son of Sahure. Until recently, scholars believed that King Shepseskare had ruled for 7 years. However, new evidence has surfaced, pointing to him being in power for a few weeks. Of course, with his parentage not following the king's standard succession at the time, it is believed that he might have been a usurper to the throne, one who had only been able to successfully claim the throne for a few weeks or possibly months. Aside from the official list of kings, his name does not appear anywhere in the accounts of other noblemen and high officials of the time. This omission has led scholars to believe that his reign must have been extremely short not to warrant any writing. Still, as king of the 5th dynasty, he must have considered building a pyramid and a sun temple in his name. Upon further research, we found out that he had indeed intended to build a sun temple that was to be called Hotepibre, or Satisfied is the Heart of Ra. However, his reign ended before any concrete blueprint could begin. He must have immediately started work on his pyramid because a structure in Abu Sir was found. Evidence points out that this was meant for the short-lived king, and it seemed as if the work was left unfinished after just a few weeks of work. Nusere Ini. Finally, we encounter a king whose reign left a significant mark on ancient Egypt. Nusere Ini, the 6th pharaoh of the 5th dynasty, ruled for an impressive 25 to 35 years, a feat that was not common among his predecessors. He was the brother of Neferir Kare Kakai, and his reign was a period of substantial growth and development. While his predecessors had merely set their eyes on building a mortuary complex and a sun temple, Nusere Ini had plans beyond these two. Of course, it might be argued that he had the luxury of time, but he was considered the most prolific builder of the 5th dynasty. During his reign, Nusere Ini undertook monumental construction projects that were unprecedented in the 5th dynasty. He built 3 pyramids, a remarkable achievement that set him apart from his predecessors. His most significant contribution was the construction of the extensive temple to the sun, god Ra, Shesepibre, a structure that was a testament to his grand vision and dedication. Although his reign might not have been famous for his military actions or state reforms, His contribution mainly remained in construction. However, he managed to continue trading with his neighbors in Byblos and operating quarries in Sinai and Nubia during his reign. During his time on the throne, he had built on the initial plan of a governing state, but with high court officials appointed among Egypt's different regions. As a result, his administration expanded, and his court spread across the entire land. Menkauhor Kayu. After King Nusere-ini, King Menkauhor became king of Egypt's preeminent civilization. We cannot establish his relationship with his predecessor or identify his parentage or offspring. He may have been Kenthaus III's son, but no concrete proof exists. Regardless, he held the throne in Egypt for nearly a decade, allowing for minor variations. As was the trend of his time, Menkauhor began constructing his pyramid and a sun temple the moment he stepped into power. For the latter, he called it Akhet Ra, which roughly translates to the horizon of Ra. Despite two more heirs, the 5th dynasty's last sun god temple was built here. Little is known about his other activities outside of his construction projects. According to some texts, he is believed to have continued quarrying in Sinai for copper and turquoise. When he died, he was laid in a small-scale pyramid called Netjer Isut Menkauhor, or the Divine Places of Menkauhor, in Saqqara. Archaeologists will later name it the Headless Pyramid. His funerary cult lasted up until the dissolution of the Old Kingdom, Djedkare-Isesi. Another king who lasted more than a few short years in the 5th dynasty was King Djedkare-Isesi. His parentage is not entirely clear-cut, but the previous ruler's transition was without any problem, leading scholars to believe he was still part of Userkaf's family tree. During his 40-year reign, Djedkare-Isesi left a lasting legacy by introducing significant reforms that reshaped the standards and traditions set by his predecessors. Notably, he broke away from the architectural tradition of building a temple for the sun god, a move that is believed to have paved the way for Osiris's ascendancy. Aside from discontinuing an essential architectural tradition, he focused on state reforms instead of religious matters. Most of his domestic reforms had been reorganizing the royal pyramid's priesthood. He also reinstated princes' ability to own land and estates. When it came to his architectural projects, his focus was mainly on constructing his pyramid in Saqqara. A few mastabas might also have been built on his command, but other than these, Djedkare-Isesi mostly used the 4 decades of his rule to polish government reforms. He also continued to pay heed to trading relations with neighboring nations and the quarry of stones and minerals in Sinai and Nubia. When he died, he was buried in a pyramid called Nefer Djedkare, which boldly translates to Djedkare is perfect. Unas. Finally, we come to the end of the line of the 5th dynasty succession to the throne. Egypt's last ruler, who was speculated to be Djedkare-Isesi, reigned for about 20 to 30 years. His time as the pharaoh had ushered in unbelievable economic loss and the throne's loss of power. Somehow he had managed to unravel all of the reforms initiated by his predecessors to cement the throne's influence over all aspects of Egyptian life. In his years at the seat of power, he had unwittingly decentralized the state. It ended with the king being less powerful than they initially had. This decentralization had been so destructive that its effects rippled 200 years later all the way to the collapse of the Old Kingdom. When it came to construction, Unas had built his pyramid in Saqqara. His was the smallest of the royal constructions. Despite its size, it was the first pyramid to have internal walls called pyramid text. This was where he was buried in his death, likely beside the tombs of his sons and daughters who had died before him. Sure, he continued trading with the neighboring nations. Furthermore, he might have sent out a few military expeditions. However, Egypt was once again ready for a new era of kings in his time. Unas attributed the death of the fifth dynasty to himself. The end of the fifth dynasty. It is essential to mention that the divisive appointments of dynasties have only begun in contemporary times. As someone living in the Sun King's era, the concept of dynasties is likely not familiar. The transference of power does not hold much consequence, and interest in the succession of the throne was nothing but mild. Still, it is time to say goodbye to the fifth dynasty. It is hard to tell whether it ended because Unas could not provide an heir or because of economic instability. We do know that chaos and darkness followed the fifth dynasty. Some scholars believe that the nation, for a time, did not have anyone at its head. There was a chaotic break between the fifth and sixth dynasties, they say. Thus, we leave with this knowledge. It is tragic, yes. Nevertheless, the sixth dynasty awaits, and there is so much more that we need to uncover about Egypt's ancient civilization. The 11th dynasty. Ra rises again. The 11th dynasty of Egypt has two parts, from 2134 to 1991 BC. The first half consists of the last few years of the first intermediate period, during which conflict arose among Upper and Lower Egyptian cities. Meanwhile, the second half begins with the Middle Kingdom, during which a unified Egypt's growth is evident. Towards the end of the 10th dynasty of Egypt, a civil war broke out between Thebes and Heracleopolis, cities from Upper and Lower Egypt. The Thebans won the conflict, which caused Heracleopolis's downfall and its rulers' surrender. These significant events ended the first intermediate period and paved the way for the Middle Kingdom's start, a new period that began with Egypt's 11th dynasty. The 11th dynasty of Egypt showed the power of Theban's local rulers after Thebes won the civil discordance. Nevertheless, what caused the rift? Let us do a quick backtrack. The previous kings came from the city of Heracleopolis. While they were in the seat of power, they failed to conquer the people of Upper Egypt. The former leaders also allowed their violent allies from Asyut province to attack the region, causing the people's anger, especially those who came from Thebes. The Asyut showed no respect towards sacred corpses, tombs, and statues by vandalizing them. The acts resulted in strife between the leaders of Heracleopolis and Thebes. The latter won the war under the Theban nomarch's leadership, a provincial governor, known as Mentuhotep. Heracleopolitans lost their power and control over the region, while Thebes already had the authority to govern. In 2134 BC, Mentuhotep. I established the Theban rulers, giving birth to Egypt's 11th dynasty. Details about the post-war events are not clear and adequate, but some scholars believe that Mentuhotep was removed from the throne or died. It is also important to note that some contemporary inscriptions mentioned a certain nomarch, Intef the Elder, as the first leader before Mentuhotep. Even so, Theban kings continued their reign, having nomarch Intef Wam as the next leader of the 11th dynasty, ruling from 2134 to 2118. After his reign, two more Intefs became kings, still having issues with the people in Heracleopolis. Due to the ongoing problems, no central government could govern and stabilize the unstable country. Nevertheless, after the Intefs, the significant unification of Egypt began under the rule of Mentuhoteps, starting with Mentuhotep II. Mentuhotep II was the successor of the last Intef king. He was a military leader who spearheaded campaigns to stop defiant nomes and nomarchs from opposing him. He also conquered his enemies and formed the Middle Kingdom by uniting Lower and Upper Egypt. These events finally ended the first intermediate period, and to remind people of his outstanding achievement, Mentuhotep II gave himself the title, One Who United the Two Lands. The Mentuhotep kings regained the authority to rule over Egypt, including the bordering countries like Nubia and the lands that bordered Sinai. However, Their control and power weakened as Heracleopolitans and nomarchs continued to have conflicts with each other. Egyptian life was all about religion during this period, and people were obsessed with death and the afterlife. Egyptians worshipped Osiris, the god of the underworld, further strengthening the cult's popularity. As Egyptians became more devoted to their religion, the last Mentuhotep king's reign ended due to mysterious causes. However, modern scholars identified Amenemhat, the last king's vizier, a political advisor, as the leader of a successful palace coup d'etat. The alleged overthrow concluded the 11th dynasty, but established the next regime, the 12th dynasty of the Middle Kingdom period. We have just learned a few facts and a little history about the 11th dynasty of Egypt. We also know the leaders who reigned during this period, the Intefs and Mentuhoteps. This time, let us dig deeper and learn more about each of the 8 rulers during this dynasty. Let us also find out their contributions that significantly changed Egypt. If the elder, the hereditary prince and count. Not much information is documented about Intef, the elder, but sources have considered him a founding figure of Egypt's 11th dynasty and the father of Mentuhotep. Suppose the elder was not a leader, but a Theban nomarch or a political advisor who served the king around 2150 BC. With that in mind, he was a servant of one of the rulers during the 8th dynasty or a 9th or 10th dynasty Heracleopolitan king. If Intef the elder were a ruler, his territories would start from Thebes, the southern parts of Aswan, and the northern lands before reaching Coptos. Another group of nomarchs controlled the areas beyond Coptos. Historians believe that people only recognized Intef the elder as a founder after his death. Some artifacts indicate his importance during the 11th dynasty. One is his name inscription on the Karnak king list, which was created more than 6 centuries after his death. On the list, his titles are Inpat and Hatia, meaning hereditary prince and count, respectively. There is also a stele found in Dendera with a similar description of him as the Great Prince of the South, Intef. The royal family was the source of Intef, the elder's title of prince. However, no details about his parents could help identify his royal members' relations. They mentioned his father's name, Iku, several times, but not his mother, from whom he might have inherited his title. Another title that Intef the elder may have received is Intef Aa, which means born of Iku. Moreover, Senusret I, a pharaoh during the 12th dynasty, built a seated statue symbolizing Intef the elder as a scribe. Although his contributions to Egypt's reformation were not that grand, Intef the elder was still important during the 11th dynasty. According to a family tree, he could be Mentuhotep I, the king who united ancient Egypt. Aside from that, because 3 rulers were Intefs, his most outstanding contribution might be the line of kings he helped create. Mentuhotep Bam, pleased is the Lord Ra. After Intef the elder, let us know the successor and the more known first king of the 11th dynasty, Mentuhotep I. His reign was short-lived as he was on the throne for only a year, 2134 BC. Nevertheless, even if his kingship did not last long, he helped strengthen the 11th dynasty and transform a better Egypt. Maybe Mentuhotep's greatness was due to his name. Mentuhotep is derived from Manchu, the god's protector and sun god of warfare. He had a Horus name, Tepio, which translated to the ancestor. Neb help Re, a throne name signified pleased is the Lord Ra, also identified him. Little is known about his family history. There is no trustworthy information that could tell who his birth parents were. Nevertheless, some historians say his father was his predecessor, Intef the elder. His wife, on the other hand, was Queen Sneferu. She gave birth to their 2 sons, Intef I and Intef II, who also became kings during this period. We know his name and a bit about his family, but how was he a king during the 11th dynasty? As the successor of his probable father, Mentuhotep had a massive responsibility on his shoulders. His reign started in the latter years of the first intermediate period when economic struggles and political instability persisted. He also had to deal with diseases, famine, flood, and a civil war between Heracleopolis and Thebes, as stated earlier. Remember what caused the conflict. Asyut vandalized the sacred corpses and tombs in Upper Egypt, outraging the people, especially those from Thebes. The blasphemous acts that the Asyuts had done fueled the Thebans to seek revenge against them. Mentuhotep I, the next in line to the Theban nomarchy, became the Thebans' leader and initiated the fight against Heracleopolis and the Asset's rulers. The vengeance was successful, and so was Mentuhotep I for conquering the Heracleopolitans. These events resulted in the inception of the 11th dynasty under his rule. Although Mentuhotep I reigned for less than a year, he had a strong reputation as a leader and a military commander. Some documents about this period reveal that his subjects knew him as the slayer of Asiatics, Libyans, and Nubians. He was a great king and could have done more if his reign had lasted for many years. It's unclear whether his kingship ended through removal, abdication, or death. Furthermore, similarly, there was no known cause of his death. Who would not admire Mentuhotep I's bravery and passion? He was a worthy leader who could influence other kings. Nevertheless, he might be non-existent. Some scholars speculated that he was a fictional character during the 11th dynasty and became prominent under the succeeding kings' regimes. Disappointing, right? However, that should no longer be the case. It no longer matters whether he is real or not. The important thing is that he represented something relevant, and we must acknowledge that he had done something beneficial for Egypt. If I, maker of peace in the two lands. During this period, the second pharaoh, or third ruler, was Intef I, one of Mentuhotep I's sons. Initially, his titles were the hereditary noble and the lord and great chieftain of the south, Intef. Nevertheless, under his regime, he was the first king to assume a pharaonic distinction with a Horus name, Sehertawi. The name had various translations, such as pacifier of the two lands, he who has brought calm to the two lands, and maker of peace in the two lands. He was also the first ruler to proclaim himself as the king of all Egypt and have his name engraved on a cartouche. From his name alone, we can say that Intef I was a kind and peace-loving pharaoh. However, historians believe he embodied the opposite as he waged wars against neighboring territories. Before we delve into that, let us return to when he started his reign. Suppose I succeeded his father, Mentuhotep I, to the throne when Egypt was extremely unstable and chaotic. This was the time when Heracleopolis and Thebes still had unresolved conflicts with each other. When he became the pharaoh, he continued to fight against the kings of Heracleopolis and their allies. Aside from the ongoing rifts, the country experienced a severe famine. During his reign, a severe drought caused Lake Fayum to dry up. People were hungry, and worse, they could not cultivate crops due to the absence of water. Egypt was in an economic crisis because the two problems were happening simultaneously. It was more volatile after the Old Kingdom collapsed. Nevertheless, where was Intef I when the country was on edge? Well, he had political problems of his own. While Egypt had enormous crises, Intef I's legitimacy to rule was questioned by Heracleopotan kings and the other nomarchs of Egypt, including those who came from Dendera and Coptos. Heracleopolis Magna's 10th dynasty leaders contested the current king, who wanted to acquire the throne, and their ally Ankhtifi, the nomarch of Hierakonpolis and a loyalist of the Heracleopolitan dynasty. If I defeated the Heracleopolitan kings and Ankhtifi, it was speculated that he controlled more nomes, provinces, expanding his territory. He acquired 3 nomes from the southern part of Thebes to Elephantine and some areas in the nome of Coptic. However, it might have been Mentuhotep I who achieved the territorial expansion before Intef I ascended to the throne in other sources. However, whether we should credit Mentuhotep or Intef for this achievement, these theories remain uncertain, considering the limited historical records about the 11th dynasty. Furthermore, if Intef I did extend his power, he failed to fulfill his objective of reunifying Upper and Lower Egypt. Unlike his predecessor, I had a more extended reigning period running from 4 to 16 years within the 2134 to 2118 BC time frame. Nevertheless, ideally, he was not an effective leader. Aside from his conflicts with the other kings in Lower Egypt, historians say that he also got into a war with the North's territories. He conquered those areas and expanded his kingdom even farther north. Unfortunately, it is unclear how his reign ended and how he died. However, there is evidence of his burial site. El Tarif, a burial complex in the Theban necropolis, housed a Saf tomb. During that period, the burial site was made for a king, and the Saf tomb was built of rocks with a courtyard and a facade made of pillars. The grave chambers and shrines where ceremonial offerings took place were located behind the frontal pillars. The pillar rows had a maximum of 24 columns. The sides were the royal court's chamber tombs. All the Intef kings during the 11th dynasty were buried in the same location. Based on scholarly records, it was not known whether Intef I was married or not. There was no information about whether he had children. When he stepped down from the throne or died, his brother Intef II took over and became the next king. Intef II, strong in life. Because if I had no children, his brother, Intef II, would succeed to the throne. Intef II became the 3rd king, or 4th ruler if Intef the Elder is counted, of the 11th dynasty, and reigned for 49 years from 2118 to 2069. Historians believe Intef II did not receive a full ancient Egyptian royal title of 5 names. However, he claimed the dual titularity of Enswt Baiti and S3 Re, son of Ra, emphasizing the nobility of his kingship. When he ascended the throne, he was identified with a Horus name, Wahunk, strong in life, or enduring of life. His name speaks a lot about what kind of leader Intef II was. When Egypt was still in turmoil, he emerged victorious in uniting the different provinces in the country. He expanded the Theban kingdom farther than his predecessor, strengthening his power as a king. When Anktefi died, Intef II successfully united all nomes from the south to the First Cataract, including Aswan and Elephantine. In his 30th year as a king, some areas of Lower Nubia were under his control. He also controlled Abydos when he defeated the Heracleopolis Magna rulers, extending his territory to the 13th province. In addition, a stele in his tomb's courtyard describes his conquering thine expeditions. This gives us an idea of how big the Theban kingdom had become during his reign. His territory extended north of Aphroditopolis, the 22nd nome of Upper Egypt. Nevertheless, of course, the expansion of his kingdom was not the only highlight of his reign. Intef II established friendly relations with other leaders after the conflicts, and the rest of his regime went smoothly and peacefully. At the onset of the Middle Kingdom era, he started the continual tradition of building structures for the royal family in Upper Egypt's local temples. Because the country was at peace, Intef II's governance had no significant problems. He was not alone in running the country. He had a few people who served and helped him govern. Intef II's chief treasurer. He was also the chamberlain of Intef II and the next king, Intef III. As a result, he was an official who came from El Kab. He looked after the 3 nomes in the southernmost part of Upper Egypt. Those provinces were territories of the Thebans, but they had no nomarchs. He was one of Intef II's military officers who fought against the Heracleopolitan armies based in Abilene's province. This event occurred when Intef II's armies moved north to the current king's conquering expeditions. Iduju Iker. He was a chief based in Lower Nubia. He helped Intef II take over Abydos. Intef II served the country for almost half a century and left a stable government in Thebes when he died. Unfortunately, there are no records that could tell the cause of his death. He did have a successor named Intef III. We will know him in a while. But the name of his mother or wife is unknown. A staff-type tomb with 2 rows of pillars and entryways leading to a substantial trapezoidal courtyard laid him to rest. Like Intef I, he was buried in the Theban necropolis. As part of his nomarch ancestors' tradition, a biographical stele was erected at his tomb's entrance. It describes the significant events of his regime and states that he was a ruler for 49 years. A different stele mentions his dogs, and another stele talks about Bela. We found the artifact near the offering temple. Intef III, the possessor of a perfect beginning, is victorious. Moving on to the next king of the 11th dynasty, we meet Intef III, the son of Intef II. Just like his predecessors, Intef III also had his own Horus name. He was called Nakhtneb-Tepnefer, which is closely translated to the possessor of a perfect beginning is victorious, or victorious one, the Lord of the good beginning. Intef III had 2 wives. Ao was his first wife and queen, while the second wife was Hens. Queen Aya gave birth to her successor, Mentuhotep II, who was credited with ancient Egypt's successful reunification. They also had 2 daughters, Sneferu and Tem. Some Egyptologists believe that Queen Ea and Intef III were siblings due to an inscription that revealed her as both the king's mother and daughter, Motnesat and S3Tnesat, respectively. Similar inscriptions were also on the tomb of Sneferu II, the wife of Mentuhotep II. The inscriptions depicted Queen Ea as Sneferu I's mother, making her and Mentuhotep II siblings. Hence, I did not have any child with Intef III. We know that Intef II held the throne for 49 years, meaning that Intef III took over as the king when he was already middle-aged or older. Based on the Turin canon, he reigned for 8 years, but his kingship dates are not accurate. The estimated dates are 2069 to 2061 BC, 2063 to 2055 BC, and 2016 to 2009 BC. Intef III had a relatively short reign. It is incomparable to Intef the Elder's and Mentuhotep I's rule, but 8 years is still short. Despite his short-term regime, Intef III had made a reputation as one of the kings of the 11th dynasty. He was active in the military. He took care of the extensive territories in Upper Egypt, which he inherited from his predecessors, his father and grandfather. He also expanded his kingdom, conquering areas in Asyut, north of Abydos Nome. His domain likely extended until the 17th century, demonstrating his family's dominance over most of the region. However, the expansion might also be his son's work during the early years. His contributions did not seem grand, but Intef III led a peaceful country. Uncredited for wars or economic crises, Intef III may have left his most incredible legacy. Just like everybody else on this list, Intef III died with no known cause. Maybe he died of old age, a disease, or assassination. All we can do is speculate. However, he was a king, and an Egyptian king deserved a proper burial like his father and grandfather. They laid Intef III to rest in the same location as his predecessors. They also buried him in a Saf tomb without any inscription. Nebupetre Mentuhotep II, one who unites the 2 lands. While little is known about the rulers above, This successor boasts an impressive list of qualifications. Meet Nebhepetre Mentuhotep II, or only Mentuhotep II. He brought ancient Egypt back together during the First Intermediate Period and established the Middle Kingdom's era. Egyptians consider him a great national hero alongside the First Dynasty founder Menes and the New Kingdom founder Amos. Before getting into the primary juices, let us know his family first. Mentuhotep II was the son of Inter III and Queen Ea, and a sibling to Sneferu. He had a wife named Tem during his reign, but his sister was named King's wife. He also had a son, Mentuhotep III, who was the heir to the crown, but no accurate references can tell who the birth mother was between Sneferu and Tem. However, he also had 6 more women who were priestesses of Hathor. They were young, ranging from 5 to 22 years old. Like the sisters, 4 women also had the title King's wife. Mentuhotep II buried the ladies beside him because they were important to him. Mentuhotep ascended to the throne when Egypt was unstable and divided. Theban princes controlled the nomes in Upper Egypt while remaining loyal to the Heracleopolitan kings in Lower Egypt. Asyut, the region that set Upper and Lower Egypt apart, looked after a militarized border which kept the 2 regions peaceful. Nevertheless, the situation changed in the 14th year of Mentuhotep II. During the Northern War, Mentuhotep reunited both regions. How did that happen? Some speculate that Medes, an absolute ruler of Lower Egypt, died during the uprising, weakening his kingdom. This gave Mentuhotep II a perfect chance to unite Egypt again, and he was successful after defeating the Heracleopolitans. There is no known reunification date, but scholars believe it happened before Mentuhotep II reached his 39th year on the throne. Moreover, when the war finally ended, he called himself Semetawi, translating to the one who united the 2 lands. Mentuhotep II was involved in military activities. During his 29th to 31st year as king, he strengthened his armed forces by launching military campaigns under his vizier Kheti's command. He also stationed a garrison on the island of Elephantine so that his troops could move southwards more quickly. Aside from improving his military assets, Mentuhotep II also reorganized the government. Before the war, the nomarchs controlled the country, and with the central power in their hands, they had the freedom to do anything they wanted. However, when the unification occurred, the king initiated a formidable centralization law, reinforcing his authority to create governor positions in both regions. By doing so, he gained control over the monarchs. He also had royal court officials who checked the actions of the nomarchs. Despite his contributions to Egypt, Mentuhotep II was self-absorbed as he initiated a self-deification program. He had temples built for him, which are still evident now. Structures wearing the headpieces of the gods Min and Amun also represent him. However, it was his titularity that made this program all about him. He had 3 titles, and he changed them twice during his regime. The first time was when he successfully conquered Heracleopolis Magna, and the second time was when Egypt reunified. Initially, he had 2 names for his first title. The second titular consisted of 4 distinctions, and the final titular had 5 names. Before the reunification, historians believed that Mentuhotep II used up much wealth. However, he provided his people with greater security and a more stable, centralized nation, making him a popular leader during his regime and throughout Egypt's history. Sankare Mentuhotep III, giving life to the soul of Re. When Mentuhotep II's reign ended, his son Mentuhotep III succeeded to the throne. Moreover, as the new king, he inherited a healthy, thriving, and stable country from his father. He used what he got to his advantage, but he was already old when he ascended to the throne. He only reigned for 12 years, from 2010 to 1998 BC. Although he only had a short kingship, Mentuhotep III was a famous ruler during the 11th dynasty due to his architectural innovations and punt expeditions. In his last as a king, Mentuhotep III initiated an expedition to the land of Punt. Since the Old Kingdom era, no one had undertaken such an expedition. According to an inscription in Wadi Hammamat, the voyage carried 3,000 strong men led by a steward named Hanenu. Before leaving Coptos through the Red Sea, they took care of the rebels in the region and excavated 12 wells, which they could use for their future quests. The king's men returned to the mainland, bringing resources like gum, perfumes, incense, and quarried stones from Wadi Hammamat. The other known contribution of Mentuhotep III was the architectural innovation and artworks established during the Middle Kingdom. He was responsible for building several structural projects. He had a mortuary temple built near his predecessor's mortuary temple in Deir el-Bahari, but it was not finished. He also had a mud brick temple dedicated to the god Thoth, or Montu Ra. An earthquake in the latter years of the dynasty might have destroyed the temple at Thoth Hill in Thebes. Mentuhotep III adopted a Horus name, Sankkhare, or Sanktawif, which means giving life to the soul of Re, or the one who invigorates the two lands. Not much is known about his family history. However, many believed his father was Mentuhotep II, and his mother was Queen Tem. Some sources also say he was Sneferu II's son, his father's sister. Information about his immediate family is not clear either. However, historical studies have pointed out that his queen consort might have been one of his harem wives, Imi, who gave birth to his successor. However, these theories are all subject to debate. Many scholars speculate that Mentuhotep IV's mother might have been Imi. If that were true, then Mentuhotep III's wife could be Imi. Nebtawaya Mentuhotep IV, the Lord of the Two Lands. We are on to our last king of the 11th dynasty. The successor of Mentuhotep III is his son, Mentuhotep IV, who only reigned for 7 years. Unfortunately, there is not enough information about what age he ascended to the throne, and little has been known about how he was as a king. Many of the king lists do not contain any details about Mentuhotep IV. However, the Turin king list has 7 missing years toward the end of the 11th dynasty, which could have been the reigning years of Mentuhotep IV. According to some sources, Mentuhotep IV may have the reputation of being a usurper who got into his position inappropriately. He once had an opponent, maybe a member of the royal family, who used a royal title to identify him, the latter, as the first heir to the throne. It was an issue for the current king because its highest position was strictly inherited through royal mothers. It was a way to prevent confusion among the pharaoh's children. Another conjecture reveals that the early pharaohs of the next dynasty rewrote and changed history. It was reportedly their way to prove their throne claims, as some leaders may not be heirs. In his second year as king, Mentuhotep IV organized an expedition between the Red Sea and the Nile Valley, where they quarried stones. While searching for the materials to construct buildings and his sarcophagus, historians believe they discovered a high-quality stone block during a rare storm. Regrettably, whether he used this material to construct his house, coffin, or tomb remains unclear. It is also difficult to tell where his resting place is. A theory suggests that the history of ancient Egypt likely erased Mentuhotep IV after his death. In this context, it's possible that they reused his tomb to eliminate any evidence of him as a pharaoh. There are also no known depictions of him today. His reign's only evidence is 20 inscriptions with his name that the expedition members allegedly engraved. Moreover, no artifacts can tell how he ended his throne and the cause of his death. It is also possible that they left without an heir to the throne. The 11th Dynasty Family Tree. Technically, the 11th dynasty of ancient Egypt begins with the short-lived kingship of Mentuhotep IV and ends with Mentuhotep IV's death. It consists of the latter years of the First Intermediate Period and the Middle Kingdom's inception, highlighting the country's reunification under Mentuhotep II's regime. Below is the family tree, which shows the royal family members during this period. Like many other periods, the family tree in this dynasty is unclear and lacks accurate details. It also presents obscure, polygamous, and incestuous relationships, which are evident in other royal family trees. The 12th dynasty. Flourishing kingdoms. The year 1985 BC, possibly a few years, give or take, and the once infant Egyptian civilization has come a long way from its genesis. The sophistication of mortuary complexes has increased, literary pieces have undergone refinement, and the succession to the throne has become more orthodox. In a time considered the Middle Kingdom's crux, the nation thrived and was free to pursue its economic advancements. Finally, the people of Egypt's ancient civilization were no longer plunged into darker times, but were instead blinking at the possibility of stability and, dare they think, grandeur. Unlike the previous dynasties, the chronology of the 12th dynasty is little debated. Egyptology established the order of its pharaohs, and each participated in the growth of the Middle Kingdom. 8 kings reigned in 213 years, but if Manetho's version is believed, there may have been 7 kings in 160 years. 8 kings in 213 years. How much influence did they hold that could have possibly changed the course of ancient Egyptian history? 8 kings in 213 years. What were the driving forces behind their policies? Were they motivated by greed, ambition, or a deep reverence for their country and its people? There have been 8 kings in 213 years. We honor these pharaohs and determine what they have done to propel Egypt's preeminent civilization to modern times. Take a walk with us through the dunes of time and back to the turning point of Egypt's history, the 12th dynasty. The 12th dynasty at infancy, life at the apex of the Middle Kingdom. To give you a glimpse into what life had been like in the 12th dynasty, we introduce you to a man named Hekanakht. Hekanakht was a man who lived at the end of the 11th dynasty and the better part of the 12th, whose correspondence had been immortalized through a series of short letters found at Luxor's banks. The famous crime writer Agatha Christie, one whose name you might not expect to be included in this book, has taken the letters and introduced an exciting murder mystery twist. Let us examine this man's life for now, but you can read about it later. Scholars have labeled Hekanakht as ill-tempered, overly critical, and selfish, but that is unimportant here. However, it's important to note that Hekanakht was both a farmer and a mortuary priest. By the standards of his time, Hekanakht could afford his family a comfortable life. He owned several land properties thanks to his employment as a priest or farmer. He acquired some of his property through inheritance and others as payment for his mortuary priest services. As a priest, the policies of the time would have likely awarded him with a land grant that allowed him to cultivate properties in a period beyond certain limits set by the law. Save for the regular payment of taxes on the properties he owned, Hekanakht was guaranteed full governance over his land and the people who worked for him. The system was relatively simple during his time. He paid authorities with the farm's bounty for freedom over his property. At other times, barley, cloth, and copper were the tools of the trade, too. In modern times, this is what one may consider taxes. Hekanakht's contemporaries, the priests, received these taxes. Unsurprisingly, there was no notion of separating the church and the state. The idea of divine right governed the land, with the pharaoh mediating between his people and the gods. As such, it made sense for his advisors and foot soldiers to be the priests. This assertion of divine right trickled down to implementing the law and even commerce. temples were the foremost recipients of the bounty of the land. The priests served as the middlemen between the farmers and the pharaoh. In exchange for their service, the temples they served and resided in received large quantities of commodities and grain. This was the economic model of the time, an operation that heavily benefited priests and priests-turned-entrepreneurs such as Hekenacht. We may protest against this type of governance today, but the ancient Egyptians willingly surrendered power to the priests, likely for the idea of a safe passage to the afterlife. Thus, with the acceptance of authority derived directly from the gods, the Egyptians of the 12th dynasty lived in contentment. Peace was still rather strained on some parts of the timeline. Famine and food crises, a significant mark of the previous dynasties, still gripped the terrified nation. Even the well-to-do priest-turned-farmer Hekenacht mentioned the land's severe difficulties due to the lack of sustenance from the Nile. Partial flooding over the years also meant the partial growth of cultivated lands. Regardless, the reputation of Egypt's prosperity continued to spread abroad. The 12th dynasty, despite its struggles, was still a time of significant advancement for Egypt, especially in the arts. The fall of Heracleopolis. Funny enough, the things that distinguished the Old Kingdom ushered in its demise: the pyramids. After Giza and the architectural achievements of the 4th dynasty, the pharaohs used up a significant chunk of the throne's treasury to create and maintain these mortuary complexes. The priests inherited this power and received generous compensation for their services. As time went on, they began to accumulate wealth and thus power. Of course, the pyramids of late pharaohs were located in districts outside of Memphis. With the outflow of money from Memphis to the priests that governed said districts, wealth, and the natural order of things, power was transferred from Memphis to these districts. This marked the final stage of the Old Kingdom and the rise of the first intermediate period. In a tale as old as time, we all know that power follows where the money is. Thus, the once united Egypt found itself divided again. Memphis, where the pharaohs ruled over the land, no longer became the nation's powerhouse. Instead, the time's capital became Heracleopolis, where all the nomarchs, the kings of the smaller districts, reigned. However, as fate would have it, this was not the case for long. Suppose one such nomarch began to initiate a rebellion against Heracleopolis. Mentuhotep completed his efforts, and Heracleopolis fell as this new hero emerged. He ruled from the newly appointed capital of Egypt, Thebes, the birth of the Middle Kingdom. Most accounts of the 12th dynasty pinpoint it as a time of the rise of the Middle Kingdom. This period has been considered a classical age throughout the nation's history. Given the sheer number of literary pieces and artistic masterpieces produced during this period, this was indeed a time for the scholars and artists of ancient Egypt to thrive. Of course, we shouldn't discount the previous era. The 11th dynasty had set the foundations for artistic possibilities, but we have the 12th dynasty rulers, architects, and artists to thank for the flourishing of these artistic sensibilities. But before we discuss this dynasty's contributions to Egypt, we must understand what slowed its rise, at events that preceded it. In this case, we know that the 12th dynasty arose not from the 11th dynasty, but from an interim period between these two dynasties, the first intermediate period. In such an interim, the government was in chaos. Confusion, famine, and separation defaced a once proud and robust nation. It fell upon King Mentuhotep to unite a once again divided country. Thus you meet the first pharaoh of the 12th dynasty, the second Menes. This was what the scholars called him. If you recall the previous dynasties, Menes, or Narmer, as others claim, was the king who united Upper and Lower Egypt into one nation. Mentuhotep faced a yet again divided nation and united it under his reign. His efforts had been successful, and he rallied to take control of the chaos of the land. However, as Mentuhotep soon discovered, Egypt had undergone years of transformation and strife. As such, it could no longer return to the norms of the Old Kingdom. We called for an overhaul of the more conservative paradigm of previous dynasties. The Old Kingdom only knew of a centralized government with complete rule over the people and the land. However, the first intermediate period challenged this standard. Instead of leaving nothing but the spoils of skirmish and suffering, it gave birth to a time of independence and wisdom. The numerous districts and their citizens were no longer meek followers of a singular king. Instead, they have learned to think for themselves and to value their sovereignty. Thus, Mentuhotep, quickly becoming privy to this call for a different type of government, swiftly responded. He and his viziers knew things could no longer return to the old structures after Egypt's reunification. They instituted a system that appointed lesser officials. They were free to govern over their appointed districts, but they still answered to one authority, the pharaoh Mentuhotep. However, the government structure was not the only change during this period. Art in the Old Kingdom was uniform, commissioned by royalty, and created according to their artistic sensibilities. However, the influence of the first intermediate period was soon to change all this. After the reunification, it soon became blatantly clear that the art scene in Egypt had changed. Art became much more diverse with the varied cultures and realities of the different districts. Regional influences became the perfect ground for artistic expression. This new normal had been the driving force behind the 12th dynasty, known as the Classical Age. It was once considered the high point of Egyptian culture and became the cornerstone of Egyptian art as we know it today. Mentuhotep II, the second Menes. Some scholars believe that Menes only existed in legends. Whether such a man existed is not the argument here. Instead, it is what Menes represented. He was the hero who unified a once divided land. His unification of the land followed a period of wealth and a vast and powerful empire. Mentuhotep was to follow in his footsteps 100 years or so later. He became the second Menes, reunifying Egypt and bringing a new era to Egypt's history, the Middle Kingdom. Mentuhotep was, of course, not without support when he defeated Heracleopolis. His predecessors, Intef I and Intef II, had started the rebellion against the city, but Mentuhotep was the one to see it end. His first few months in power were about solidifying his claim to a now unified country. He had to ensure no counter-rebellion to the one he had just staged. Thus, he ensured that the nomes who had pledged loyalty to the divided district's old kings were swiftly punished. Once he had eradicated the possibility of anyone challenging his authority, he soon turned his attention to solidifying the militia. Under his command, he fortified military efforts against Nubia and Canaan. Soon enough, he also learned that the nation responded best to separating districts. Instead of resisting this demand, he created posts for his trusted advisors so they could govern in his stead. This was how he enacted a policy of centralization under the divisive guise that satisfied the people. He also began advocating for the recognition of pharaohs as their own deities. This was how he had ensured the loyalty and admiration of his people. This campaign for deification was apparent in the temples and art credited to his time in power. Temples and funerary complexes were created in his name. He had somehow adapted to the demands of the times while still following some of the beliefs of the Old Kingdom. Much like his predecessors, Mentuhotep II was not to forget the importance of building a mortuary temple for his afterlife. True to his reign, his mortuary temple also took inspiration from the Old Kingdom traditions while introducing innovativeness to the project. From an architectural perspective, his complex on the cliff at Deir el-Bahri was a cutting-edge creation. However, What set the complex apart were the religious alterations he had introduced. Before him, mortuary complexes had always been pharaoh-centric. The pharaoh had built everything, including the rooms and offerings, for his enjoyment in the afterlife. Mentuhotep's complex was different. He also insisted on offering offerings to Amun-Ra and the god Osiris, rather than to himself. He also commissioned the work of many Theban artists to decorate the halls of his temple. The artistic fashion of his time consisted of exaggerated lips and eyes, but thin bodies. His successors to the throne were to follow the architectural vogue inspired by this bold pharaoh. The kings and queens of the classical age. Mentuhotep II eventually succeeded Mentuhotep IV. Their reign had been silent and prosperous. Nevertheless, Amenemhat and his family soon intercepted the Mentuhotep's reign. They were to rule over Egypt for the next 200 or so years. We will now introduce you to the 8 kings and 1 queen who held Egypt's nation to greater and wealthier times. From Amenemhat to the last ruler, Sobekneferu, we trace the affluence of the 12th dynasty and its contributions to the powerhouse that was ancient Egypt, Amenemhat I. Many scholars believe that the 12th dynasty only began with Amenemhat simply because the succession of the throne for the remainder of the era fell solely to his family. Amenemhat I had been a vizier to Mentuhotep IV. Mentuhotep IV sent him on an expedition to quarry stones for his architectural projects. At the appropriate time, he ensured that someone penned an inscription detailing his experiences, which he called miracles. His inscriptions later revealed that the gods had chosen him to reign as the pharaoh. But to the people of Egypt, the inscription had served as a prophecy that someone named Ameni would come from the south and rule as king. Thus he did. He ruled over the land from a city called It-Tawi, just at Memphis's foot. He named it, which translates as Amenemhat takes possession of 2 lands directly. People speculate why he relocated the nation's capital to this uncharted territory. His rule had been somewhat disorderly, and it ended with his assassination. His death and the following events became the muse for the Egyptian classics, the Tale of Sinuhe, and the instruction of Amenemhat, Sesostris I. In his 20th year in power, Amenemhat I appointed his son, Sesostris I, as co-regent to the throne. Such co-regency lasted up to 10 years, with the younger pharaoh leading the military expedition in Nubia. They both worked to build the wealth of the 12th dynasty of Egypt by mining copper in Sinai. Such was the relationship of their co-regency. Sesostris I took care of military conquests, and Amenemhat busied himself with domestic reforms. While out on conquest in Libya, news of Amenemhat's death reached Sesostris. He hurried home for burial arrangements and disseminated his father's work, the instructions of Amenemhat. This work included Amenemhat's charitable deeds throughout his rule, and his wish for Sesostris to assume the throne. Sesostris, having secured the power, returned to Nubia to establish his dominance definitively. In his 18 years on the throne, the young king had successfully conquered Nubia. Egypt now had unlimited access to Nubia's rich resources, which included copper, gold, diorite, and amethysts. Within Egypt, quarries for gold and granite were also set up. Without question, Egypt's royal treasury had significantly grown with the reign of this enterprising young king. To demonstrate the grandeur of his rule, Sesostris started several improvement projects all over the land. He started rebuilding Heliopolis near Cairo and built a temple of Karnak in Thebes. He took these actions to establish a bridge between Egypt and its neighbors, the Syrians and Palestinians. Nearing the end of his reign, true to what his father had done, Sesostris appointed his son Amenemhat as co-regent. He died 2 years after this political move and was buried in a pyramid that he had built near Al-Lisht. Amenemhat II. Before Sesostris's demise, he appointed his son, Amenemhat II, as co-regent to the throne. This was no doubt meant to ensure that the succession remained in the family. During their joint power, Amenemhat took responsibility for the expeditions in Nubia, just as his father had done as co-regent to his grandfather. However, after 2 years of co-regency, he assumed full control over the throne following his father's death. He busied himself with furthering the initiatives that his predecessors had started. He went on to strengthen the relationship with neighboring countries. He continued the exploits of Nubia and Sinai's resources, copper and gold. Amenemhat II ruled the country during a generally peaceful and incredibly wealthy time. They had dug up some of the temples dedicated to him, revealing statues of him adorned with gold and silver. There were also signs of trade with foreign countries, such as Mesopotamian cylinder seals in his temple. Amenemhat appointed his son, Sesostris II, as co-regent in the course of action that had become a tradition. When Amenemhat died, he was buried near his father and grandfather in a pyramid tomb south of Memphis. Jewels adorned his tomb, a testament to the artistic era he reigned over. Sesostris II. Amenemhat II's son secured the throne immediately after his death. Before this, he was co-regent to the throne for 3 years before his father's death. Sesostris II, not inclined toward military exploitation, dedicated his life to maintaining peace in Egypt, even as he managed the quarry in Nubia. He had rebuilt the fort near the gold mining region. He had also kept close contact with their neighboring nations, Palestine and Syria. By then, intermarriages had become a strategy for fortifying alliances, leading to the marriage of his noble family members to other countries' leaders. One of his significant projects was creating the Al-Fayoum near the stream connecting to the Nile. The Nile's level regulation ensured that its annual inundation could no longer claim as many lives and wreak so much havoc on the land. This was his greatest accomplishment, one that the people of Egypt were undoubtedly grateful for. Sesostris II was buried in a pyramid he had built near Al-Lahun when he died. His reign had been peaceful and without turmoil. Sesostris III. His father may have favored peace over the uproar, but Sesostris III certainly had other ideas. He completely overhauled the government system during his reign and ensured that Egypt continuously expanded its territory. When he stepped into power, alliances with provincial nobles had been strong, and districts had different overlords. Even tombs for these noblemen had become much more lavish than Sesostris III's liking. Soon enough, he was to stop all of this and attempt to regain the centralized power that had been the tradition in the Old Kingdom. But he did so concerning the new traditions of his era. Instead of having feudal overlords maintain power over the land, he divided Egypt into 4 central districts. Each district appointed its own officials to report directly to the pharaoh. This reform was so successful and managed to keep power within the throne that Egyptian leaders would still use the same model even a century later. However, the centralization of power was not all that Sesostris had accomplished. Sesostris also extended Egypt's territory through the Nubian area. He also trampled over the possibility of a rebellion from the Nubian nomads. After his death, Sesostris III was immortalized in Herodotus's works and eventually became Nubia's patron deity. Amenemhat III. When Amenemhat III, the son of Sesostris III, ascended to the throne, Egypt was experiencing prosperity and stability. However, this new king wanted to bring Egypt even more bounty and wealth. Egypt's economic prosperity peaked during his reign. One of his more remarkable projects had been the regulation of the inflow of water from Lake Moeris. Regular flooding of this lake resulted in the loss of numerous resources, making stabilizing water levels a much-needed project. He furthered this action plan by draining out the marshes around the lake. further reducing the possibility of flooding in its surrounding areas. Over 60,000 hectares of land had been reclaimed and was rife with agricultural use. Such colossal success warranted not just one Colosseum, but two. However, his reign was not limited to land reclamation. Amenemhet also worked in the mines at Sinai. He built permanent quarters for the workers there, driving back any attack attempts on his people in the quarry. The only drawback during his reign was the minor raiding attempts in the land. Amenemhet IV. Starting as a co-regent with his father on the throne, Amenemhet IV had the honor of inheriting a land that enjoyed its prime. During his reign, Egypt became an international powerhouse with a strong influence among its contemporaries. Like his predecessors, Amenemhet IV continued quarry projects in Sinai and Nubia. In the former, he built the temples of Hathor and Renenutet. He maintained trade relations with the foreign city of Byblos, Lebanon today. He also initiated 4 expeditions in Sinai, which marked the Middle Kingdom's last expedition. During his reign, he managed to maintain the nation's wealth. He saw several temples constructed and maintained alliances with neighboring and far-flung countries. However, the abundance that Egypt was enjoying was quickly ending. In his death, Amenemhet IV was buried in a tomb not yet excavated by archaeologists. However, there have been a few that are speculated to hold his remains. Sneferu. After a long line of rulers in Sesostrisarn's family, we come to the last pharaoh of the 12th dynasty, Sneferu. She was Amenemhet III's daughter and had assumed the throne after the death of her half-brother. To this day, Sneferu remains the first confirmed queen of the Egyptian throne. There have been speculated queens before her, but none have been confirmed. This new queen was to rule for only 3 years, 10 months, and 24 days. Several temples and monuments were constructed under her brief rule. Despite the brevity of her time in power, she extended the tomb of her predecessor, Amenemhet III. This complex is known as the Labyrinth of Herodotus. She also initiated a few constructions in Heracleopolis. Many depictions of the queen have shown her wearing male clothing. However, ancient inscriptions have clarified that she proudly wore her role as queen. Theories have suggested that she might have merely posed with male clothing to dismiss her critics. Similar to the previous ruler, her tomb remains unidentified to this day. She was without heirs when she died, thus concluding the glory of the 12th dynasty of Egypt. Art in Egypt's classical ages. Before the 12th dynasty, art was solely commissioned by the nobles. Their tastes and the main subjects largely dictated the art scene. However, art took on a fresh new perspective in the Middle Kingdom. Kings and gods remained the main subjects, but other things were being written about and sculpted. These included ordinary people's everyday lives, commentaries, and representations of the human experience. The 12th century gifted history with works such as Dispute Between a Man and His Bee and The Tale of the Shipwrecked Sailor. Many writers stepped forward to share their gifts, and instead of facing rejection, they received honors as geniuses of their time. Even during the early stages of the 12th dynasty, a masterpiece called The Tale of the Eloquent Peasant was published as a commentary on the way of life in Heracleopolitan society. It rallied for a just ruler who should take on a father's role in the nation, rather than a mere king who would oversee Egypt from afar. In painting and sculpting, there has also been an emergence of interest in the commonplace living of the commoner. The sands, the Nile, and Egypt's agricultural fields took on deeper meanings as they became painters' muse. The Field of Reeds was one such masterpiece produced during the 12th dynasty. Newer brands of artistry also introduced statues. There had been a sudden focus on lifelike creations. During this period, Sculptors also introduced the artistic form of block statues. This was to become an expression for sculpting well into the Ptolemaic age. This was usually done by creating an image of a squatting man or woman and then focusing on the face's details. In architecture, Mentuhotep's mortuary complex was the primary model. Mentuhotep's temple served as a benchmark for the construction of subsequent temples. However, while stunning in design, the pyramids built during this period were not as sturdy as those built during the Old Kingdom era. This likely explains the scarcity of pyramids from the 12th dynasty. The architects of the 12th dynasty built the temples using sun-dried bricks, limestone, and granite. The bricks were made from the hardened mud of the Nile. Perhaps one architectural success that deserves mention is the Black Pyramid of Amenemhat III. It was considered the first pyramid to hold the king and his queens. Out of the 11 pyramids built in Dashur, only 5 survived the tests of time. How did this pyramid earn its baleful name? Of course, its decaying and dark appearance gave rise to its name among modern scholars of Egyptology. Limestones have fortified the mud bricks, enabling them to endure generations. Perhaps because of the 12th dynasty's lack of conflict, or probably because of its wealth, the art scene thrived during this period. Whatever the reason, thanks to the freedom and celebration of the 12th dynasty's geniuses' artistic sensibilities, the nation enjoyed wealth and beauty. The end of the classical age of Egypt. The dynasty that succeeded the classical age marked a significant departure from this era. Although it still patterned its policies after the pharaohs of the 12th dynasty, it could not maintain the abundance that the 12th dynasty had been enjoying. Consequently, the flourishing art scene of the 12th dynasty ceased to exist. The Middle Kingdom marked a significant period of peace and wealth in Egypt. It eventually became the standard of living for the people and the standard of ruling over the land for the succeeding pharaohs. Although the country continued to be unified, chaos again fell upon the land with the dissolution of the 12th dynasty. Nevertheless, as the Egyptians believed to be accurate at the time, life in this dimension was merely fleeting, and so had been the 12th dynasty. 8 kings in 213 years was certainly enough to impact ancient Egypt's culture and elevate the